The morning rose over Atlantis as it always had, with a sun that seemed to favor this island above all others on earth. It was a sun that cast the world in gold and crimson, a light that caught the magnificent outer wall of the city and made it blaze. This was the great wall of brass which encircled the entire metropolis, and on this final day it shone with a particular feverish intensity, as if the metal itself were ill. The air was unnaturally still, heavy and warm, carrying the scent of salt, exotic blossoms from the royal gardens, and something else, something like the smell of old stone, of deep, disturbed earth. The great canals that flowed between the concentric rings of the island were placid, their surfaces like dark glass, reflecting the cloudless, pale blue sky with a disquieting perfection. Citizens moved along the wide avenues and over the arched bridges, their steps unhurried, their voices murmuring the easy cadences of a people who had never known true fear. They were, after all, Atlanteans. The world belonged to them. The gods were their ancestors. What was there to fear? Before you get too comfortable, my lord, and let the hum of my voice lull you completely, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. It is a small tribute, ensuring our nightly stories may continue. Now, settle back into your silks. Let the world outside fade away. The people of the capital city, Poseidonus they called it in honor of their patron god, were busy. In the markets of the third ring, merchants from Egypt and Tyre haggled over bolts of linen and casks of wine, their voices a familiar song of commerce. They laughed as a slight tremor, no stronger than a passing chariot, rattled a display of painted pottery. Such things were common on a volcanic island. In the sacred groves of the central Acropolis, priests prepared for the evening rites, their white robes immaculate, their minds on the complexities of celestial alignments and the proper portion of the bull to be sacrificed. They did not notice that the birds in the groves were silent, their usual chorus absent from the heavy air. On the race courses, young nobles trained their horses, their shouts of exertion echoing against the stone amphitheaters. They were invincible, golden, the pinnacle of 10,000 years of civilization. Their empire stretched from the shores of Europe to the coasts of Africa. Their armies had never been defeated. Their navy commanded every wave of the great ocean that bore their name. Hubris was not a sin to them. It was simply an accurate assessment of their own magnificence. It is a curious thing, is it not, that this entire memory, this grand and tragic epic of a continent swallowed by the sea, survives because of one man. Not an Atlantean king or a high priest, but an Athenian philosopher, born centuries after the last wave had closed over the highest peaks of Atlantis. His name was Cleito, and he insisted to all who would listen that this was not a myth he had invented for illustrative purposes. He claimed it was true history, a story told to his ancestor, the great lawgiver Solon, by Egyptian priests who kept records of the world's ages. These priests spoke of a mighty power that had arisen from the Atlantic Ocean, a civilization of astonishing wealth and engineering prowess that, in a single day and night of misfortune, vanished from the world. Academics, of course, have argued ever since. Was Plato telling a cautionary tale about pride? Was he preserving a fragmented memory of a real catastrophe? Perhaps the volcanic explosion of Thera that crippled the Minoan civilization on Crete? Or was he, as he so calmly claimed, simply relaying the facts? We shall proceed as if he were, for it makes for a much better story. As noon approached on that final day, the sun seemed to hang motionless at its zenith, beating down with a strange white heat. The keepers of the great temple of Poseidon, a structure of breathtaking scale with a roof of pure ivory and pinnacles of gleaming orichalcum, noted that the sacred springs that fed the temple's baths were running warmer than usual, and with a faint, sulphurous scent. They decided it was probably nothing. The Atlanteans were masters of plumbing, with aqueducts and systems for hot and cold water that would make a later Roman engineer weep with envy. Their priests often claimed this was a divine gift, though it was rumored the Plumbers' Guild secretly took all the credit. A minor fluctuation in the geothermal system was hardly cause for alarm. A maintenance request was filed. It would never be read. Out on the western plains of the island, farmers tending to their bizarrely fertile crops noticed their livestock had grown agitated. Horses paced nervously in their enclosures, and the massive elephants which the Atlantean armies used in place of cavalry refused to be calm, their low rumbles of distress carrying for miles on the still air. The farmers looked to the sky, to the sea, and saw nothing amiss. They were a practical people, but they were Atlanteans all the same. Their faith was not in omens, but in the engineered canals that irrigated their fields, in the grain silos that held more food than they could eat in a decade, and in the strength of the royal army to protect them from any conceivable threat. The idea that a threat could come from the very ground beneath their feet was not something they were equipped to consider. In the royal palace, King Evenor II, a descendant of the great Atlas himself, held court. He listened with half an ear to a dispute between a shipping magnate and the harbor master over new docking fees. He was bored. The recent war with the Athenians had been unexpectedly trying. The primitive, stubborn mainlanders had managed to repel his forces, a shocking and humiliating turn of events. Though Atlantis still controlled nearly all of the known world, that single failure gnawed at the king's pride. An Athenian diplomat before the war had once asked an Atlantean general what their nation's greatest weapon was. The general, a man whose arrogance was matched only by the shine on his orichalcum breastplate, had replied, "Our unshakable belief in our own superiority." The diplomat had been unsure if he was joking. In truth, so was the general. Now the king felt that superiority had been questioned. He dismissed the court, wanting only to spend the afternoon in his gardens, to forget the Athenians and their irritating victory. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, the signs became undeniable. Another tremor rolled through the city, stronger this time. It lasted for nearly a minute, long enough to make the great brass wall groan like a living beast, and to send cracks snaking up the marble facades of lesser buildings. For the first time that day, a hush fell over the city of Poseidonis. People stopped in the streets, looking at one another, their confident smiles replaced by frowns of concern. The earth had always been restless here, but this felt different. This felt intentional. Then came the sea, the great, gray, endless Atlantic. For the entire day it had been strangely passive, its waves lapping gently at the massive sea walls. But now it was doing something impossible. It was retreating. The water was pulling away from the docks and canals, draining back out to sea as if drawn by a great invisible breath. The sea floor, with its kelp forests and strange rock formations, became exposed to the air. Ships moored in the outer harbor listed and fell onto their sides in the sudden muddy flats. And all across the island, from the farmers in the fields to the king in his palace, every single Atlantean turned to face the ocean. They stood, a million souls, mesmerized by the impossible sight. The sun was a fiery orange orb sinking into a bruised purple sky, and the horizon was no longer a flat, clean line. A darkness was gathering there, not the darkness of twilight, but a shadow on the water, a disturbance, a line of white that was growing taller and taller with every passing second. The whisper of the waves had become a deep guttural roar that was no longer a warning, but a sentence. "And there, my lord, we shall leave them for tonight, poised on the edge of eternity, staring at the face of their own oblivion. Sleep now if you can, for their story and their end has only just begun." But before that wave falls, my lord, before the city of brass and sorrow is scoured from the earth, you must understand how it was born. To comprehend an ending of such impossible magnitude, we must turn our gaze back through the mists of 10,000 years to the quiet, lonely dawn of its beginning. For every great tragedy is, at its heart, a love story gone wrong. Long before the canals and the temples, long before the shine of orichalcum lit the sky, there was only the island. It lay solitary in the vast, uncharted ocean, a jewel of green and gray known only to the sun and the seabirds. Its mountains were volcanic, their peaks often wreathed in steam that smelled of sulfur and creation. Its forests were ancient and deep, filled with trees that had never known the bite of an axe. And in the very center of this sprawling, beautiful wilderness, there was a low, gentle hill surrounded by fertile plains. The air here was sweet with the scent of wildflowers you have never seen, and rich, dark earth. It was a paradise, but it was an empty one, a stage waiting for its players. The ocean that surrounded this land was the domain of a god, Poseidon. We think of him as a wrathful deity, a shaker of the earth with his terrible trident, a bringer of storms, and he was all of those things. But he was also, in the beginning, profoundly lonely. To rule a kingdom of endless shifting water is to rule a realm of beautiful emptiness. His subjects were silent fish and mindless currents. He longed for something solid, something to hold, something to love that would not simply slip through his fingers like water. His gaze, sweeping over his domain, fell upon the lonely island, and upon the island he found the earth-born people who lived there. Among them was a mortal woman whose parents, Evenor and Leucippe, had recently passed, leaving her alone. Her name was Cleito. She was not a princess or a warrior. She was simply a human, living in a small dwelling on that central hill. But to the lonely god of the sea, she was more captivating than any mermaid, more precious than any pearl. He watched her as she moved through the wild gardens of the island, her grace as natural as the swaying of the trees, her spirit as clear and deep as the freshwater springs that bubbled up from the earth. He fell in love with the quiet way she existed, with her mortality, with the simple, fragile warmth of her humanity. This is a story we see echoed across countless cultures, my lord, the divine becoming enamored with the mortal. It is the universe's oldest, most flattering tale. It whispers that we, in our fleeting, imperfect lives, possess something that even the eternal gods might covet. It is a beautiful thought. It is also, almost always, the beginning of a great deal of trouble. Poseidon, being a god of immense power and very little experience in mortal courtship, approached the matter with a certain divine awkwardness. He could not simply woo her with words, for his voice could level mountains. His attempts at gentle gestures often had titanic consequences. A love song whispered on the wind might cause a hurricane 1,000 miles away. A gift of exotic corals might inadvertently create a new, razor-sharp reef that would be a menace to navigation for centuries to come. But his intent was pure, and Cleito, living alone on her quiet hill, was not afraid. She saw not the terrible god of the sea, but the profound loneliness in his ancient eyes, and she, in her own way, fell in love with him. The god was consumed by a desire to protect her. He loved not only Cleito, but her home, the very earth she walked upon. He resolved to make the island an impregnable fortress for her, a sanctuary that no mortal army or unwelcome visitor could ever breach. And so, with the force of his will, he struck the ground around her hill. The earth groaned and split. He broke the land, carving out a perfect circle around her home, and filled it with the cool blue water of his ocean, creating a ring of sea. He did this again, and then again, raising 2 rings of land and 3 rings of water in perfect concentric formation around the central hill where she lived. He was, in essence, the universe's most over-the-top home security contractor. Other men might build a fence for their beloved. Poseidon built a fortress of moats and mountains, which proved remarkably effective at keeping out unwanted neighbors, and presumably anyone attempting to sell extended chariot warranties. This act of love was also an act of supreme isolation. He had cut her off from the rest of the world, making her his and his alone. On the central island, which was now hers, he worked other wonders. He caused 2 springs of water to flow from the earth. One was a spring of refreshing cold water, and the other ran perpetually hot, providing natural baths to warm them against the cool ocean nights. He blessed the land itself, making it so fertile that it produced all manner of delicious and nourishing food in abundance, twice in every year. Cleito would never know hunger or thirst or fear. He had created for her a perfect, self-sustaining world. A gilded cage, perhaps, but a cage of unimaginable beauty and comfort. In time, their union bore fruit. Cleito gave birth to 5 pairs of male twins, 10 sons, half god, half mortal, the first princes of this newly formed kingdom. The very firstborn of the eldest pair was named Atlas, and Poseidon, in his fatherly pride, decreed that the entire island would be named Atlantis, and the great ocean that surrounded it, the source of all his power, would be called the Atlantic in his son's honor. To each of his 10 sons, he gave a portion of the island to rule, with Atlas as the high king over them all. They were the beginning of a new race, a people with the blood of a god in their veins and the soul of humanity in their hearts. This divine heritage gave them virtue, wisdom, and strength beyond all other mortals. But the mortal blood, as Plato warns, carried with it the seeds of greed, ambition, and pride. For a long time, the divine nature would hold sway. But nothing mortal, not even when touched by a god, can last forever. So you see, my lord, the magnificent city that faced its doom on that terrible evening was not built by ordinary men. It was born from a god's affection. Its impossible geography was the architecture of love. Its first citizens were demigods. They began as something pure, something blessed, a perfect fusion of heaven and earth. Remember this, as our story continues. Remember the quiet hill, the lonely god, and the mortal woman. Remember that the foundations of the world's most arrogant empire were laid not in conquest, but in tenderness. And so, from a god's love and a mortal's heart, a new race was born upon the sacred island. Sleep, my lord, for tomorrow we shall watch them build a paradise. Sleep has refreshed you, my lord. Let us return now to that island of demigods, where 10 new kings, with the echoes of divinity still humming in their blood, looked upon the raw and sacred geography their father had made for them. They stood on the shores of those perfect circles of land, gazing across the perfect circles of water, and saw not a fortress, but a canvas. Their father, Poseidon, had provided the bone structure. It was now their sacred duty to give it flesh. And so the age of building began. For generations, the children of the 10 kings labored, not with the desperation of men trying to tame a wilderness, but with the joyful artistry of those seeking to honor a divine gift. They did not fight the land, they adorned it. From the mountains in the island's heart, they quarried stone of 3 distinct colors. There was white stone, as pure as sea foam. There was black stone, as dark as the abyssal depths. And there was a curious red stone, the color of a blushing sunset. They did not build with one color alone. Instead, they tessellated them, creating buildings with intricate patterns, walls that were mosaics of black and white, towers striped with red. The entire city became a work of geologic art, a tapestry of the earth's inner beauty brought out into the sun. But stone, however beautiful, was not enough to capture their ambition. They had a legacy to uphold, a divine heritage to display. The kings commanded that the great defensive walls surrounding each ring of land be sheathed in metal. The outermost wall, the first a visitor would see as they approached from the sea, they covered entirely in brass. On a clear day, it would have been a ring of solid gold on the horizon, a beacon visible for 100 miles. The next wall, which encircled the second ring of land, they coated in tin, making it shine with a cool, silvery light, like the moon brought down to earth. And the final wall, the one that guarded the central Acropolis, the Holy of Holies where the palace and greatest temples stood, that wall they covered in a metal you have never seen. They called it orichalcum. Plato tells us it glowed with a fiery red light, a ring of eternal smoldering fire to protect the sons of the sea god. Imagine it, my lord, a city of concentric glittering rings, one of gold, one of silver, one of fire, all rising from a sapphire sea under a perfect sky. Yet this magnificent geometry presented a practical problem. How does one live and trade in a city of isolated circular islands? The Atlanteans, being the children of a god and the greatest engineers of the age, found an elegant solution. First, they built bridges over the rings of water, their arches soaring high enough for the tall masts of a trireme to pass underneath without snagging. But the true stroke of their genius was the Great Canal. They carved a channel 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and nearly 6 miles long, running in a perfectly straight line from the open ocean, cutting through all 3 rings of land and water, and terminating in a grand harbor at the very heart of the city, right beside the central hill. Philosophers since have often wondered if Plato was dreaming or remembering. Were there whispers in his time of the great canals of Egypt, or the immense moats of Babylon? Perhaps, but the scale, the perfect geometry of Atlantis was something else entirely. It was not just a city with a harbor, it was a city that had inhaled the ocean itself. This grand canal was the artery of the empire. Ships from every known land sailed down its length, past the glittering walls of brass and tin, to deliver their goods directly to the markets of the inner city. It was a masterpiece of civic engineering. It also, one must assume, created the world's first marine traffic jams. As impatient sea captains from Lydia and Crete argued over the right-of-way, their creative curses echoing off the multicolored stone. Some things, it seems, are truly timeless. Within these rings, life was ordered and abundant. The outer rings of land were the most populous. Here, the Atlanteans built vast gymnasiums for the training of the body and mind, public gardens and great circular hippodromes for their beloved horse races. The thunder of hooves a constant, exhilarating rhythm in the life of the city. The harbors they carved into the land rings were immense, filled with docks for hundreds of warships and thousands of merchant vessels. The forests of masts so thick they almost blotted out the water. And of course there were the baths. Remembering the two springs their divine ancestor had created, the Atlanteans built two vast sets of public baths. One set was fed by the hot spring, another by the cold. There were separate pools for men and women, for royalty and for commoners. They even built separate, luxurious baths for their horses and other beasts of burden, believing that all creatures who served the state deserved comfort and cleanliness. It was a remarkably progressive notion. One can easily imagine that a royal Atlantean stallion enjoyed a more luxurious spa day than most foreign kings, complete with heated pools and premium, hand-selected oats. A visiting dignitary is said to have mistakenly used the equine bathhouse and later remarked that the service was excellent, though the masseuse was a bit heavy-hoofed. The central island, the original hill of Cleito, was the most sacred and most beautiful place in the entire world. Here stood the royal palace, a building of sublime and understated elegance, and the original ancient temple dedicated to Cleito and Poseidon. The entire Acropolis was enclosed by that glowing wall of orichalcum, and within it, the descendants of the 10 kings lived, breathed, and ruled an empire that was fast becoming the master of the world. The city was a perfect system, a machine for living, engineered for commerce, defense, and beauty. Water flowed through it like blood. The people moved across it with an easy, confident grace. For 1,000 years it worked in perfect harmony. And so, my lord, the paradise was built. It was not just a city, but a statement, a declaration in stone and metal that here, the children of a god had made their home. It stood as a beacon of what humanity could achieve when blessed by the divine. But even the most perfect machine, when operated by imperfect hands, will eventually begin to rust. Sleep well, for tomorrow we shall look past the shining walls and into the hearts of the people who called this paradise home. A city, no matter how magnificent, is merely a shell, my lord, a collection of stone and metal, of water and light. Its soul is found in its laws and in the character of its rulers. So let us now look past the glittering walls into the very heart of the Atlantean government and upon the 10 kings, the sons of Poseidon, who were bound by a strange and solemn pact that ensured centuries of peace. Poseidon, in his wisdom, did not create a single absolute monarchy. He knew that the mortal heart, even one with a few drops of divine blood in it, is a vessel easily corrupted by absolute power. Instead, he divided the island into 10 separate kingdoms, one for each of his sons. The line of Atlas, the firstborn, was given the capital city and held the title of High King, a position of great honor and respect, but he did not rule alone. The empire was, in essence, a confederation, a brotherhood of kings. No major decision, no war, no great law, no treaty, could be made without the deliberation and consent of all 10 rulers. This system ensured that no single king could ever become a tyrant. It also ensured that royal council meetings could last for days, as the 10 monarchs argued over such vital matters as the appropriate tariff on imported spices or whose turn it was to fund the annual all-kingdom chariot race. Even demigods, it seems, are not immune to the tedious nature of governance by committee. The foundation of their entire legal and spiritual world was not a scroll or a book, but a pillar. In the center of the great temple of Poseidon, on the sacred Acropolis, stood a single massive column wrought from pure orichalcum. This was no creation of mortal hands. It was said to have been placed there by Poseidon himself at the dawn of the kingdom, and upon its fiery metallic surface, the god had inscribed his laws. These were not complex legal statutes, my lord. They were simple, profound principles. The 10 kings shall not take up arms against one another. They shall come to each other's aid in times of war. They shall hold counsel together and act with a common wisdom. They shall not put to death any of their kinsmen without the consent of at least half of the 10. Their rule was to be one of mutual defense, shared power, and restraint. This tradition of engraving laws on a public monument is a fascinating echo of our own world. Centuries later in Babylon, King Hammurabi would carve his famous code onto a towering stone stele for all to see, establishing that justice was not arbitrary, but written and known. The Pillar of Atlantis, however, was something more. It was not a king's decree, subject to amendment. It was the immutable sacred covenant between a god and his children, the very anchor of their civilization. To ensure these laws were never forgotten, the kings took part in a solemn ritual. Every 5th or 6th year, they would gather at the temple. Within the sacred enclosure, a herd of bulls roamed freely, consecrated to the god. The 10 kings, alone and armed only with wooden staves and nooses, for iron was forbidden in this holy place, had to hunt and capture one of these powerful beasts. It was a test of their strength, their courage, and most importantly, their ability to work together as they had in their father's law. The captured bull was then led to the top of the orichalcum pillar. There, above the sacred inscriptions, its throat was cut, and its blood was allowed to cascade down the fiery metal, washing over the engraved words of Poseidon. It was a visceral, powerful symbol. Their right to rule, their very laws, were being reconsecrated in blood, renewing the pact. The kings would then collect the blood in a great golden mixing bowl, pouring in wine to create a potent libation. Each of the 10 would dip a golden cup into the mixture and drink, swearing a great oath to the gods that they would rule according to the laws written on the pillar, that they would judge righteously, and that they would uphold the ancient bond of their brotherhood. After the oath was sworn, the kings would retire to cleanse themselves and don magnificent ceremonial robes of a deep celestial blue. They were said to believe this particular color aided in clear judgment, though one suspects the sheer comfort of the fine fabric was just as helpful for a long night of work. By the light of the dying sacrificial fire, they would take their seats on 10 stone thrones arranged around the pillar. All through the night, they would act as the supreme court of the entire empire, hearing the most difficult cases and passing judgments upon their people and upon each other. When dawn broke, their rulings were inscribed on tablets of gold, which were then stored forever within the temple archives. For many generations, my lord, this system was the bedrock of a true golden age. The divine nature that Poseidon had passed to his sons was still strong within their lineage. They were renowned throughout the world not for their wealth, which was already becoming immense, but for their virtue. They were temperate, wise, and just. They saw their power not as a right, but as a sacred duty. They governed a populace that was content, prosperous, and secure. The city of concentric circles was not just an architectural marvel. It was a social one, a place where the laws were fair and the kings were brothers. For as long as that sacred blood washed the pillar, and for as long as the oath was honored in their hearts, the empire of Atlantis knew only peace and prosperity. The pact held. But blood, my lord, can be diluted over generations, and metal, even divine orichalcum, can begin to tarnish when reflected in the eyes of greedy men. Sleep now. For tomorrow we shall examine the incredible wealth that this virtue brought them, a wealth that would in time become a most terrible poison. Virtue is a noble thing, my lord, but a virtuous and peaceful kingdom, one where brothers do not wage war and the law is held sacred, inevitably becomes a prosperous one. Wealth flows to stability as surely as a river flows to the sea. So let us now pull back from the solemn temple and the king's council and marvel at the breathtaking, almost scandalous material abundance of the Atlantean Isles. The land itself was their first and greatest treasure. Poseidon's blessing had made the island a cradle of life. The vast central plain, sheltered by the northern mountains from the harsh winter winds, was covered in soil so rich and dark it seemed to breathe. The intricate network of canals, drawing water from the rivers and springs, allowed for 2 harvests every single year. They grew grains, succulent fruits, and vegetables in quantities that could have fed the entire world. In the cool highlands, dense forests of ancient trees provided an endless supply of timber for their houses, their furniture, and most importantly, for the thousands of ships that made up their mighty fleet. The island was also home to a breathtaking array of animal life. Great herds of cattle and sheep grazed in the meadows, and in the marshes and wetlands surrounding a vast inland lake, there lived the most majestic of beasts, the elephant. There were more elephants on Atlantis than anywhere else in the world. Their mighty forms a common sight as they moved through the tall grasses. Even the air was rich. The island produced fragrant plants and herbs in profusion, their roots and blossoms yielding precious aromatic saps. The scent of balsam and exotic spices hung in the markets, a constant heady perfume that spoke of a land dripping with natural bounty. Atlantis was a self-sustaining paradise. It needed nothing from the outside world. It was the world that would soon need and desire what Atlantis had. For the true source of their power lay not on the surface, but deep within the volcanic bones of the island. The mountains were laced with veins of precious metal. Miners, organized into guilds of almost priestly status, delved into the earth, pulling forth a seemingly inexhaustible supply of copper and tin. Deeper still, they found silver, which they prized for its moon-like luster. And in the oldest, deepest tunnels, they found what all men of that age coveted most: gold. It was so plentiful that it became a common building material, used to adorn the statues of gods and to gild the ceilings of public buildings. A visiting dignitary might be served a meal on a solid gold plate, a gesture not of extreme extravagance, but simply of casual abundance. It's said that one of King Atlas's youngest sons once complained that his solid gold rocking horse was too heavy to rock properly, a problem that remarkably few children in history have ever had to face. But there was another metal in their mountains, a substance unique to their island, more precious than silver, and second only to gold in its value. It was the metal you have heard of before, the one that covered the citadel wall with a mysterious, fiery light, orichalcum. What was this strange substance? The philosopher Plato, our only guide, tells us it was mined from the earth in many parts of the island. He speaks of it as a distinct and singular element. For centuries, this has been a delightful puzzle for scholars. Some argue it must have been a natural alloy of copper and zinc, a form of brilliant brass that the ancients, without modern chemistry, would have seen as a unique metal. In a fascinating twist, modern archaeologists recently recovered dozens of metallic ingots from a 600-year-old shipwreck off the coast of Sicily. When analyzed, they were found to be a brass-like alloy, and the triumphant discoverers boldly claim to have found the lost orichalcum. The debate, of course, continues to rage. Let us imagine the mines. Deep within the mountains, in shafts warmed by the geothermal heat of the dormant volcanoes, the Atlantean miners would find it. The raw ore would not have the dullness of common rock, but would glitter even in the torchlight, its surface veined with a shimmering reddish mineral. The air would be thick with the smell of sulfur and hot stone. When smelted and refined, it produced a metal of breathtaking beauty. It was strong, durable, and strangely resistant to the corrosive touch of salt water, making it invaluable for coating their ships and decorating their seaside architecture. It was also, according to the palace archives, notoriously difficult to keep polished. An entire legion of royal servants was employed for the sole purpose of buffing the great citadel wall, a job that certainly offered stunning views, but must have been terribly monotonous. They were, my lord, the world's first professional wall polishers. This incredible wealth, for now, was a blessing. It was the engine of their golden age. It allowed them to build their perfect city without levying harsh taxes. It funded the creation of magnificent public works, temples, gardens, and gymnasiums for all to share. It gave them the leisure to pursue knowledge, to map the stars, and to contemplate the nature of the gods. Their society was one of balance. The common farmer, the city artisan, and the royal prince all benefited from the island's bounty. Their power was not yet built on conquest, but on the simple, astounding luck of where they had been born. They were rich, my lord, rich beyond the wildest dreams of any pharaoh or emperor who would follow them. They were draped in gold and housed in splendor, with fiery orichalcum lighting their way, all of it drawn effortlessly from the blessed earth beneath their feet. They had everything a people could ever desire. And as you know, a person who has everything is in the most dangerous position of all. They begin to believe they have earned it, sleep now, and dream of glowing mountains. For tomorrow the simple laws of Poseidon will begin to face their greatest test. An abundance of wealth, my lord, often brings with it an abundance of strife. Gold breeds greed, and property breeds disputes. In most nations, a mountain of treasure would require a mountain of laws to manage it. Yet in the golden age of Atlantis, this was not so. Their society for a time was as serene as the surface of their canals on a windless day. Let us now examine how those simple laws which you remember were inscribed by a god's hand on that fiery pillar of orichalcum shaped the very soul of their civilization. The legal system of Atlantis was not a sprawling, tangled code of regulations and subclauses. It was a set of guiding principles, a cultural compass inherited from their divine ancestor. Remember the oath the 10 kings swore over the blood of the bull? To aid one another, to show restraint, to deliberate together in wisdom. For many centuries, these were not just royal duties. They were the values that permeated every level of society. The divine nature, still strong in their veins, made the people naturally inclined towards harmony and fairness. They looked upon deceit and avarice not merely as crimes, but as spiritual sicknesses, a forgetting of their noble origins. Because of this, daily life was marked by a profound and simple trust. Disputes, when they arose, were rarely about malice or theft. They were matters of honest disagreement, and they were settled not in great, intimidating courts, but before local magistrates or respected community elders. These judges based their rulings on the clear spirit of the law, on what was fundamentally fair, rather than on technicalities. The profession of the lawyer, the paid advocate, skilled in the art of twisting words to obscure the truth, simply did not exist. An Atlantean citizen would have been baffled by the idea of hiring a stranger to argue on their behalf. Their legal philosophy was simple: tell the truth and trust in the wisdom of the judge. The concept of a legal loophole was as foreign to them as snow. This, incidentally, meant that Atlantean dinner parties were likely far more pleasant, with a conspicuous lack of litigious guests. Here, my lord, it is hard not to see the hand of the philosopher Cleito, sketching a portrait of his own utopian dream. In his most famous work, The Republic, he imagined a perfect state ruled not by politicians, but by wise philosopher kings, a society where justice was the highest possible virtue. Perhaps in this tale of early Atlantis, he was giving us a mythic version of that vision. He was describing a world where law is not a complex and flawed human invention, but a divine inheritance. A society where people are not forced to be good by 1,000 complicated rules, but where they simply are good, because their divine nature has not yet been eroded by mortal failings. This inherent virtue was the great engine of their golden age. It is the reason the staggering wealth you heard of, the gold, the silver, the orichalcum, did not immediately corrupt them. Plato is very clear on this point. For many generations, he tells us, the Atlanteans despised everything but virtue. They carried their great fortune with a light heart, believing that prosperity grew from mutual trust and goodness. They saw their wealth not as a personal possession to be hoarded, but as a communal resource, a gift from the island itself. And so, the riches of the mines were channeled into projects that benefited everyone. The magnificent temples were open to all. The public baths, fed by the hot and cold springs, welcomed the artisan as well as the aristocrat. The grand canals that made their city a wonder of the world served the humble fishing boat as well as the royal barge. The Atlantean Treasury Department must have been the most straightforward in history. Its annual report likely consisted of 2 items. 1. Mined a literal mountain of gold. 2. Spent it all on really nice things for everyone. This led to very short council meetings and a general sense of public satisfaction, a model that subsequent governments have struggled mightily to replicate. For 1,000 years, this perfect balance held. The 10 kings ruled as brothers, the people lived in harmony, and the island was a vision of celestial order brought down to earth. Their society was a finely tuned instrument, and it played a beautiful song. But its flaw, my lord, was its very perfection. It was a system designed for demigods, and it was fragile. It depended entirely on the continued strength of that divine nature within their hearts. It relied on the assumption that they would always despise greed and honor virtue. But with each passing generation, the blood of the god grew thinner, diluted by mortal marriages. The divine inheritance began to fade, like an echo in a deep canyon. And as it faded, the mortal part of their soul, with its capacity for jealousy, its hunger for power, its whispering pride, grew stronger. The simple laws on the pillar remained unchanged, but the hearts of the people who read them began to change. And soon they would begin to look at the sacred words not as a guide to living, but as a set of rules to be bent. The laws of the pillar held them in a state of grace for centuries. Justice was swift, life was fair, and the city was a mirror of a perfect divine idea. It was a paradise governed by a beautiful simplicity. But a simple lock, my lord, is no match for a complicated key, and the mortal mind, when it turns to ambition, is the most complicated key of all. Sleep now, for tomorrow we shall walk through the gardens and the gymnasiums and see the daily life of a people at the very peak of their perfection, just before the long fall begins. A just society, my lord, is a calm one. Having seen the laws that bound them and the wealth that blessed them, let us now walk among the Atlanteans themselves. Let us spend a single perfect day in their shining city to see what life was like for a people who had not yet learned the meaning of discontent. The day in Poseidon began not with a clamor, but with a gentle awakening. As the sun rose, its first rays would strike the great outer wall of brass, setting it ablaze and casting a warm, golden light across the entire metropolis. The sounds that followed were ones of order and peace. The soft lapping of water against the stone embankments of the canals, the distant musical cry of a fruit vendor on his barge, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of an artisan's hammer from a workshop. Citizens emerged into the clean, wide streets, their movements purposeful but never hurried. Small, elegant ferryboats, serving as public transport, would begin their silent glide across the rings of water, carrying people between their homes on the outer rings and their places of work or leisure within. There was no frantic rush, no desperate scramble. The city moved with the slow, confident grace of a tidal current. A great portion of the morning was devoted to the body. The Atlanteans, like the Athenians Plato so admired, believed in the ideal of a sound mind within a sound body. To them, physical fitness was not a matter of vanity. It was a moral and spiritual duty, a way of honoring the perfect forms their divine ancestor had bestowed upon them. This concept, which the Greeks would call kalokagathia, was the belief in the unity of the beautiful and the good. A strong, graceful body was seen as the natural vessel for a clear mind and a virtuous soul. And so, the gymnasiums, which occupied vast spaces on the outer rings of land, were the true social heart of the city. These were not dark, enclosed spaces. They were magnificent open-air complexes, with shaded colonnades for conversation, manicured fields for games, sand pits for wrestling, and perfectly level tracks for running. Here, people of all classes would gather. You might see a revered philosopher, after a morning spent pondering the eternal nature of the cosmos, engaging in a vigorous wrestling match with a stonemason. The stonemason usually won, which one imagines did wonders for keeping the nation's philosophers refreshingly humble. Young men and women trained their bodies with a joyful devotion, their discus and javelins flashing in the sun. This was not training for war, not yet. It was a celebration of life, of the sheer, exquisite pleasure of having a body that was strong, healthy, and capable. As the sun reached its peak, the pace of the day would slow. The abundance of the land and the efficiency of their society granted the Atlanteans a gift that few other civilizations have ever known: ample leisure. The afternoons were for the soul and for society. Many would wander through the immense public gardens, serene landscapes planted with strange and beautiful trees that dripped with fragrant resins, their flowers casting a heady perfume into the sea air. Others would flock to the great public baths. Remember, my lord, the two springs Poseidon had created, one of hot water and one of cold. The Atlanteans had channeled this divine gift into vast bathing complexes, with pools of varying temperatures, steam rooms, and cool marble halls for relaxation. They were the great equalizers of society. Here, a shipwright could soak in the same healing waters as a prince, and all barriers of rank were washed away in the steam. They were hubs of conversation, of politics, of gossip. If you truly wanted to know what was happening in the city, you did not need to consult a spy master. You simply took a long soak in the hot baths and listened. The city's ferrymen were also figures of great renown for their knowledge, known for their ability to navigate the canals with breathtaking skill. They were also, it was whispered, the most incorrigible gossips. They were the city's original social media network. The grand canals were the city's arteries, constantly pulsing with life. Barges, low in the water, would bring in the morning's harvest from the fertile plains. Piles of glistening fruit, baskets of grain, fresh vegetables still wet with dew. Sleek passenger boats, painted in bright colors, moved silently between the rings. And always, there were the foreign ships, their captains and crews, gazing up with wide-eyed wonder at the glittering walls and impossible bridges. They brought tribute and trade from the far corners of the world, but mostly they brought back stories of the incredible city that sat in the middle of the ocean, a place more like a dream than reality. As evening approached, a different energy would fill the air. The sounds of hooves and the roar of a crowd would drift from the hippodromes on the outer ring. Chariot racing was the passion of the Atlanteans. The spectacle was breathtaking. Teams of powerful horses thundering around the track, their chariots, light as seashells, seeming to fly over the packed earth. It was a display of speed, courage, and the perfect bond between man and beast. They lived, my lord, in a waking dream. Their days were measured by the sun and the tide. Their bodies were strong, their bellies were full, and their city was the most beautiful thing ever built by mortal hands. It was a life without sharp edges, without desperation, without true struggle. And a people who have never known a hard day, how can they possibly recognize the true face of temptation when it finally arrives, smiling and offering them even more? Sleep now in the imagined peace of that golden city, for that peace is not destined to last. A paradise, my lord, can begin to feel like a cage if its people possess a curious heart. And the Atlanteans, as the children of the sea god himself, could never be content with just their perfect island. The vast ocean that Poseidon had shaped to protect them also called to them with a siren's song. The endless horizon was not a wall, it was a promise. So let us now leave the tranquil gardens and noisy hippodromes, go down to the great harbors carved into the land, and set sail with the legendary fleet that made the entire world its domain. The ships of Atlantis were unlike any others on Earth. They were born from the island's unique bounty. Their hulls were laid with the strongest timber from the ancient highland forests, wood that was dense and resilient. Their masts, tall enough to pierce the clouds, were single, perfect trees. But their true advantage was a secret that no other nation could replicate. The Atlanteans sheathed the undersides of their ships in thin plates of orichalcum. That strange, fiery metal, which you remember was so resistant to the corrosive bite of salt water, made their vessels almost immortal. While the ships of other lands would rot and weaken after years at sea, the Atlantean hulls remained pristine, gliding through the water with an unearthly speed and silence. They were not merely boats, they were works of art, intricate with carvings. Their sails dyed a deep sea blue, a moving tribute to the god who had fathered their race. In the early centuries, their voyages were not driven by a lust for conquest. It was a sacred exploration, a deeply felt need to know the full extent of their father's kingdom. The sea was in their blood. The first Atlantean explorer, so the story goes, set out with a grand sense of destiny and returned 3 days later, having gotten hopelessly lost just out of sight of the Great Brass Wall. He reported discovering a new land of strange rocks and angry seagulls, which, upon further investigation, turned out to be the undeveloped western side of his own island. Navigation, it seems, always requires a bit of practice, but they learned. Their astronomers became the best in the world, mapping the stars of the night sky to guide them. Their captains learned the secret language of the winds and the currents, and soon their silent, gleaming ships began to push into the unknown. Their primary destination was the world you know, the great basin of the Mediterranean Sea. To reach it, they had to sail through a place that was, to the rest of humanity, the very edge of the world. A narrow strait, flanked by 2 great mountains of rock. The ancients called them the Pillars of Hercules. Today, you call it the Strait of Gibraltar. For the Egyptians, the Minoans, and the early Greeks, the Pillars of Hercules were a place of profound terror. It was the end of the map, the gate beyond which lay an endless chaotic ocean where monsters dwelled and the sun went to die. No sane sailor would venture past them. But the Atlanteans, they came from the other side. For them, the pillars were not an exit from the known world, but an entrance. Imagine the perspective, my lord. They sailed into the Mediterranean as explorers from a land beyond creation. They were, in the eyes of all they met, beings from another world. Picture the scene in an early Cretan port, a fishing village, its people living their lives by the familiar rhythm of the tides. Suddenly, on the horizon, a ship appears. It is larger than any they have ever seen, its hull glowing with a soft, reddish light, its single blue sail impossibly vast. It moves without the thrashing of 100 oars, gliding silently into their harbor. The men who disembark are tall and fair, clad in fine fabrics, their manner calm and confident. They bear no weapons, only gifts, intricate tools of unknown metals, fruits the Cretans have never tasted, textiles woven with geometric perfection. This was how the Atlanteans first entered the world stage, not as conquerors, but as mysteries, as bringers of wonders from the land beyond the sunset. For generations, this relationship was one of peaceful trade and mutual curiosity. The Atlantean fleet became the master of the seas. They established colonies and trading posts along the coasts of northern Africa, or Libya as it was then known, and up into the shores of Europe, as far as modern-day Italy. Their cartographers created maps of such accuracy that they would not be bettered for thousands of years. The Minoans' early attempts at diplomacy with these strange visitors were sometimes clumsy. It is said their first envoy to Atlantis, wishing to present a gift worthy of the High King, brought Crete's finest bull. The Atlantean king, whose people sacrificed bulls by the dozen in their temple, accepted the gift with a polite smile, and in return offered the Minoan a baby elephant. The envoy, who lived on a small island and had never seen an animal that wouldn't fit in a pasture, was politely terrified. The grand gesture, it seems, was not the most practical one. But as the centuries passed, the nature of their dominion began to change. The peaceful exchange slowly curdled. The Atlanteans, seeing their own manifest superiority in wealth, technology, and power, began to view the other nations not as trading partners, but as primitive clients, as subjects. Their outposts became garrisons. Their trade agreements became tribute demands. The awe they inspired began to be mingled with fear. Their navy, once a tool of exploration, was now the instrument of an empire, projecting their power wherever the waves could carry them. They had mapped the seas and tamed the winds. The great Atlantic was no longer a barrier. It was their personal highway, connecting their perfect island to a world that was now, increasingly, theirs to command. They were the masters of the world's tides. But the tide of human ambition, my lord, is the one sea that no navigator can ever truly chart or ever hope to control. Sleep now, for tomorrow we shall enter the grandest temple ever built, the very heart of their piety, at the precise moment that piety begins to die. A people who command the seas, my lord, must possess an anchor for their souls, a place of stillness to balance the endless motion of the waves. Having sailed to the edges of the world with their mighty fleet, let us now return with them to the very center of their island. We shall pass through that fiery, glowing wall of orichalcum on the Acropolis, past the silent royal guards, and enter the most sacred and magnificent place in all of Atlantis, the great temple of Poseidon and his mortal bride, Cleito. It stood on the central hill, the very spot where Cleito had lived, the heart from which the entire city had grown. Its scale was a challenge to the heavens themselves. It was a full stadium in length, over 600 feet, and half a stadium in width, with a soaring height that seemed to gather the clouds around its peak. As a visitor approached, the first thing they would notice was the light. The exterior walls of the temple were not made of stone, but were sheathed entirely in plates of pure polished silver. On a bright day, the temple would dissolve into a shimmering, blinding glare, a piece of the sun brought down to earth. On a moonlit night, it would glow with a soft, ethereal light, as if it were carved from the moon itself. And at each of the four corners of the roof, great pinnacles of red orichalcum thrust towards the sky, catching the light like captured flames. The temple was not merely large, its every proportion was said to be a reflection of a divine, mathematical truth. Like the builders of the great pyramids in Egypt, or later the architects of the Parthenon in Athens, the Atlanteans believed in a sacred geometry. They held that by using specific ratios and harmonic alignments, they could construct a physical space where the veil between the world of mortals and the world of the gods grew thin. The temple was not just a house for a god. It was a carefully tuned instrument, an architectural prayer designed to resonate with the music of the cosmos itself. To pass through its immense doors was to leave the world of men behind. The brilliant sunlight gave way to a vast, cool, and shadowed interior. The air was heavy with the scent of 1,000 years of sacred incense and the clean, cold smell of ancient stone. The only sounds were the whisper of priests' robes on the polished floors and the faint, echoing chant that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The entire interior, from the floor to the soaring ceiling, was lined with orichalcum, which bathed the immense space in a warm, gentle, fiery light, like being inside a glowing ember. And the ceiling, my lord, the ceiling was a wonder. It was made not of wood or stone, but of pure white ivory, inlaid and carved with the entire history of their race. There were scenes of Poseidon calming the seas, of his meeting with Cleito, of the birth of the 10 kings, and of the building of the city. To look up was to see their entire story laid out amongst the gods. The hall was filled with golden offerings, statues dedicated by the kings over the centuries, but all these were dwarfed by the breathtaking spectacle at the center of the temple. Here stood a colossal statue of Poseidon, wrought from solid gold, so tall that its head lightly brushed the ivory ceiling 200 feet above. The god was not depicted as a serene ruler, but as a dynamic force of nature, standing in a great war chariot pulled by 6 magnificent winged horses. And all around him, as if swimming through the air, were the figures of 100 sea nymphs, the Nereids, each riding upon the back of a golden dolphin. The sheer, overwhelming opulence of it was a testament to the empire's wealth, but its artistry was a testament to their devotion. Cleaning such a place was a task of truly epic proportions. A special order of priests was tasked with nothing else but the perpetual polishing of the 100 golden dolphins. It was a sacred duty, to be sure, but one imagines that after the 50th dolphin, even the most devout acolyte began to wonder if the god of the sea might have been just as happy with a more manageable number of attendants. Perhaps a single, very well-polished golden squid. Yet for all this splendor, the true heart of their faith was not the golden statue. It was the object that stood just before it, the pillar of orichalcum. Remember this, my lord, from our earlier night. This was the pillar upon which Poseidon had inscribed his laws, the place where the 10 kings swore their sacred oath, the vast temple, the silver walls, the ivory ceiling, the mountains of gold. All of it was merely a glorious shell built to protect this single, law-bearing column. The offerings were so plentiful that they had to be cleared away every few generations. One of the lesser-known priestly duties was the sacred decluttering, where they would melt down older, less fashionable statues of one's ancestors to make room for new dedications from the current kings. It was a pious act of recycling that also handily kept the temple from becoming an impassable hoard of treasure. This temple was the perfect symbol of Atlantis in its golden age. It was a place of impossible beauty, built with unimaginable wealth, reflecting a deep connection to their divine origins. For centuries, the people who entered this sacred space understood the relationship between the objects within it. They knew that the gold was meaningless without the law. It was the anchor of their faith, a building made of silver, ivory, and orichalcum, all to house a simple pillar of rules. For a time, they worshipped the rules within. But soon, my lord, they would forget the pillar and begin to worship the gold on the walls instead. And a faith that values the vessel more than the truths it contains is a faith that is already hollow. Sleep now. For tomorrow, the first almost imperceptible cracks in this perfect world will finally begin to show. The story I tell you, my lord, is an ancient one, passed from priest to statesman, from grandfather to grandson, until it found its final form in the words of a philosopher. But since that time, for more than 2,000 years, clever men and women have searched for its shadow in the real world. They have pored over old maps, excavated sunken ruins, and asked a tantalizing question. If the tale of Atlantis is a memory, what is it a memory of? Let us pause our story for just a moment on this perfect night and listen to the most compelling whisper of all, the ghost of a civilization called Crete. Long before the golden age of Athens, long before Rome was even a village, a magnificent Bronze Age culture flourished on the Mediterranean island of Crete. We call them the Minoans, after their mythical king Minos, who was said to keep a minotaur in a labyrinth. They were a people of profound artistry and skill. While the warriors on the mainland were building crude fortresses, the Minoans were building sprawling open-air palaces like the one at Knossos, a maze of colorful rooms, grand staircases, and courtyards decorated with vibrant frescoes of leaping dolphins and flowing processions. They had advanced plumbing, a written language we still cannot fully decipher, and a society that by all appearances worshipped life, beauty, and trade. And here, my lord, the first echoes begin to surface. The Minoans were the first great sea power in the Aegean. Their dominion was a thalassocracy, an empire of the sea. Their ships, though not sheathed in orichalcum, controlled the trade routes, and their influence was felt on every island and coastline. Like the Atlanteans, their power projected from an island home, and like the Atlanteans, their culture had a peculiar fascination with one specific powerful animal, the bull. The frescoes at Knossos famously depict young men and women performing a dangerous, acrobatic ritual of leaping over the horns of a charging bull. This sacred beast was at the very center of their religion, a parallel too striking to ignore when we remember the bull sacrifice that consecrated the laws of Atlantis. The similarities are intriguing, but the heart of this theory lies not in how the Minoans lived, but in how their civilization died. Around the year 1600 BC, a nearby island in the Aegean, an island we now call Santorini but was then known as Thera, suffered one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in human history. It was a cataclysm of unimaginable force. The mountain exploded with a power hundreds of times greater than any modern weapon, blasting billions of tons of rock, ash, and gas into the stratosphere. The sky for hundreds of miles would have turned black as night, blotting out the sun. The sound would have been a deafening roar heard as far away as Egypt. Then came the sea. The collapse of the volcano's caldera triggered colossal tsunamis, waves of impossible height that radiated outwards across the Aegean. These waves would have slammed into the northern coast of Crete, which was only 70 miles away. They would have annihilated the Minoan fleet where it sat in its harbors. They would have scoured coastal cities and towns from the map, burying them under a thick blanket of pumice and ash. The lingering cloud of volcanic dust would have poisoned the air and the soil, leading to famine and collapse. The Minoan civilization was not wiped out in an instant, but it was dealt a mortal blow from which it would never recover. An advanced island empire, master of the seas, crippled in a single day of fire and water. Does the story not sound familiar? This, then, is the theory, that the memory of the Minoan catastrophe was passed down for 1,000 years, a story of a great sea power destroyed by the gods. It traveled to Egypt, whose priests were the great archivists of the ancient world. And as the story was told and retold, the details, as they always do, became grander. The island of Crete was transformed into the continent of Atlantis. The volcanic eruption was remembered as a great earthquake. The tsunamis were remembered as the sea swallowing the land whole. The timescale was exaggerated from 900 years to 9,000. And this epic, distorted memory is what the priests told to the Athenian lawmaker Solon. Historians and archaeologists have argued for decades over the details, writing scathing papers critiquing each other's tsunami models. It is a debate almost as explosive as the volcano itself. Of course, there are problems. Devotees of the theory must casually dismiss the very specific details their only source, Plato, provides. He states quite clearly that Atlantis was in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Crete is squarely within the Mediterranean. He says Atlantis was larger than North Africa and Asia combined. Crete is a lovely but decidedly smaller island. It is a rather casual way to treat the words of one of history's greatest thinkers. One imagines Plato's ghost listening in to these debates, stroking his philosophical beard and muttering, "I said it was in the Atlantic. Was my prepositional phrase not clear enough?" And so the scholars continue their whispers. Is the Atlantis myth a memory of the Minoan collapse? Perhaps. It seems likely that this real historical trauma may have been an inspiration, a seed from which Plato's grander tale grew. The ghost of Crete may well haunt the story of Atlantis. But we, my lord, are not telling the story of the Minoans tonight. We are telling the story of Atlantis itself. And in our story, as we return to it now, the great city still stands. Its silver temple gleams. Its people are prosperous, and their fleet commands the ocean. But their divine nature, the invisible bedrock upon which their entire perfect society was built, is beginning to erode. Sleep now, for tomorrow the long, slow rot truly begins. The whispers of scholars are for the waking world, my lord. Let us leave their theories of volcanoes and sunken isles and return to the dream of Atlantis itself. We left the city at its absolute zenith, a perfect society of virtuous demigods. But perfection, especially when it is touched by mortality, is a fragile and fleeting state. The cause of the city's decay was not an invading army, nor a natural disaster, nor any of the common ailments that bring down empires. It was something quiet, slow, and as inevitable as the setting of the sun, the thinning of the blood. Remember that the 10 founding kings were the direct sons of Poseidon and the mortal Cleito. They were a perfect fusion, their souls a balance of divine wisdom and human warmth. This divine inheritance was the source of their virtue. It gave them their moderation, their disdain for petty greed, their sense of justice. It was not something they learned, it was something they were. But they and their descendants took mortal spouses. And with each new generation, with each marriage to a human of the island, the divine portion of their nature was diluted. The immortal ichor in their veins grew thinner and thinner, while the mortal blood, with all its inherent passions and flaws, grew stronger. The god was slowly, imperceptibly, breeding itself out of the bloodline. The ancient Greeks had a name for this kind of process. The poet Hesiod, long before Plato, wrote of the ages of man, a great descending staircase of history. It began with a golden age, when men lived like gods without sorrow or toil. This was followed by a silver age, then a bronze, and finally his own time, a grim and laborious iron age. This belief that civilization is not on a path of endless progress, but is in a slow state of decay from a purer, nobler past, is one of humanity's oldest and most melancholic ideas. The story of Atlantis is the ultimate telling of that tale, a fall from the gold of divinity to the common dust of humanity. For a long time the change was almost unnoticeable. It was not a sudden corruption, but a gradual fading of the light. The first symptoms were subtle, like the first chill of autumn on a summer's evening. A young king standing before the pillar of orichalcum would feel not a humbling sense of sacred duty, but a secret, thrilling surge of his own power. A high priest, chanting the ancient rites in the silver temple, would find his prayers feeling hollow, the words mere habit rather than heartfelt devotion. An artisan, once content to create works of harmonious beauty for the public good, would feel a new and unfamiliar pang of desire to create something for himself, something to make him famous. The art of the city began to reflect this change. In the Golden Age, their statues and buildings were elegant, their proportions reflecting the sacred geometry of the cosmos. Now, the art became louder. Statues were carved to be bigger, not more lifelike. Temples were adorned with more gold, but with less grace. Palaces became bloated displays of personal wealth, each king trying to outdo the others in sheer ostentatious splendor. The newer generation of Atlantean nobility began to find the old ways of their ancestors rather quaint. They still attended the sacred ceremonies, of course. Tradition demanded it, but their minds would wander. During a high priest's solemn sermon on the virtue of moderation, one could spy the younger royals discreetly comparing the size of the gems on their rings under their robes. It was the divine equivalent of teenagers being bored in church. The human condition, which had been held in check for a millennium by the divine blood, was now taking over. Greed, pride, envy, ambition, these emotions once alien to them, now began to feel natural. Plato tells us that as the divine part of them faded, they became filled with unrighteous avarice and power. They began to look at their vast wealth not as a gift to be stewarded, but as a prize they had won and a weapon to be wielded. The High King, a descendant of Atlas 10 times removed, found himself thinking less about what was best for the confederation of the 10 kingdoms and more about how much he would like to build a new summer palace even bigger than his brother kings. The official reason, of course, was that it would be an inspiring symbol of Atlantean prosperity. The unofficial reason was that his brother's new swimming pool, shaped like a giant golden kraken, was just a bit too much and needed to be put in its place. From the outside, my lord, nothing had changed. The city of Poseidonis was still the most magnificent on earth. The brass wall still blazed in the sun. The fleet was still invincible, its orichalcum hulls gliding through the sea. The treasury was still overflowing. The decay was entirely internal, a sickness of the soul. The Atlanteans still looked like gods, tall, beautiful, and proud, but they had begun to think and to feel like ordinary, grasping men. The laws on the pillar were still there, but they were no longer written on their hearts. The divine spark, which had burned so brightly for so long, was now a fading ember, choked by the ash of mortal desire. From a distance, the city shone as brilliantly as ever. But if you looked closely into the eyes of its people, you would see a new and hungry light. In the shadow of their growing pride, greed was sharpening its teeth. Sleep now, my lord. For tomorrow, we will see what happens when a people who have everything decide that everything is not nearly enough.
Greed, my lord, is a fever of the soul. Once it takes hold, it burns away all that is good, kindness, moderation, justice, leaving behind only the brittle ash of desire. We saw the first chill of this sickness in the slow fading of the divine blood. Now let us draw closer and watch as the fever consumes the very heart of Atlantis.
The change, once it began, was swift and total. The sublime social harmony that had defined them for 1,000 years, shattered like a glass dropped on a marble floor. The ideal of shared prosperity was the first casualty. A new and rapacious class of nobles and merchants emerged, their appetites for wealth as vast as the ocean itself. They were no longer content with the comfort and abundance the island provided for all. They wanted more. Wealth, which had once been a communal resource, was now hoarded in private palaces, their gates barred to the common people. The gap between the fabulously rich and the ordinary citizen, once non-existent, stretched into a chasm. On the outer rings of the city, for the first time, there was want. In the inner rings, for the first time, there was gaudy, shameless excess. The spirit of brotherhood that had bound the 10 kingdoms together evaporated. The royal councils, once a place of wise deliberation, became a viper's nest of suspicion and rivalry. Kings no longer saw each other as brothers in a sacred oath, but as competitors in a ruthless game of power and prestige. The easy grace of Atlantean life curdled into a constant striving competition. Neighbor eyed neighbor with envy. Friend measured friend by their possessions. They had been a society built on trust. They became a society poisoned by ambition. The ancient Greeks had a word for the sickness that had so thoroughly infected the Atlantean soul: hubris. To us, the word simply means arrogance. But to the Greeks, my lord, it was something far more specific and far more dangerous. Hubris was the outrageous pride of a mortal who, blessed with great fortune or power, forgets their place in the cosmos. It is the insolence of a man who begins to believe he is a god. It was considered the greatest of all sins, a direct challenge to the divine order. And in the great Greek tragedies, an act of hubris always, inevitably, calls down a terrible and righteous punishment from the heavens, a punishment they called nemesis. The people of Atlantis, in their glittering city, had become a nation of pure, unadulterated hubris. Their very religion became an expression of this self-worship. They still filled the silver temple of Poseidon, but their prayers were no longer offerings of gratitude. They were demands. They came to see their immense prosperity not as a divine gift to be cherished, but as irrefutable proof of their own superiority. They were rich, they reasoned, because they were better than everyone else. They were powerful because they deserved to be. In the end, they ceased to worship the God who made them, and began, instead, to worship their own reflection in the shining orichalcum walls. The most popular form of art became the self-portrait. Nobles would commission colossal statues of themselves, often depicted wrestling lions they had never seen, or commanding armies they had yet to form. The Temple of Poseidon began to look less like a house of worship and more like a very expensive showroom for the egos of the ruling class. This moral rot seeped into every aspect of their lives. A foreign merchant, who in the Golden Age would have been welcomed as an honored guest, might now be openly cheated in the marketplace. When he appealed for justice, the magistrate, his own heart corrupted by the new philosophy, would laugh in his face, might now made right in Atlantis. Their fashion became increasingly absurd and impractical. The nobility took to wearing robes so heavy with gold thread and inlaid gems that they required 2 servants just to help them climb a flight of stairs. It was the very peak of style, but it made any sort of quick movement, say fleeing from a sudden and violent earthquake, rather difficult, a critical design flaw they would one day come to regret. Plato tells us that this transformation was total. They had lost the ability to even recognize their own corruption. To an outsider with clear eyes, he says, the Atlanteans appeared base and ugly because they had lost the most precious of their gifts. But to themselves and to others who were blinded by the worship of power, they appeared to be the very best and most blessed. They were drowning in their own moral filth, but they genuinely believed they were ascending to godhood. The sickness had consumed them. They had forgotten their father, the god of the sea, and had replaced him with the cheap idols of gold and power. They had lost the virtue that had made them great, and now all that was left was the hollow shell of their wealth and military might. Their perfect island, a paradise that could sustain them forever, was no longer enough for their boundless, cancerous appetites. And so, my lord, they began to look outwards, at a world they no longer saw as a place of wonder to be explored, but as a pantry to be raided, a collection of lesser peoples waiting to be ruled. Sleep now, for the age of peace is over. The age of war is about to begin. An empire that believes itself to be divine has no need for gods. The sickness of arrogance that we saw festering in the hearts of the Atlanteans was more than just a social ill, my lord. It was a spiritual poison, dissolving the very foundations of their world. Let us now turn our gaze to the Silver Temple and watch as they turn their backs on the source of their creation, the lonely god who still waited for them in the deep places of the sea. The sacred rites, the rituals that had anchored their society for 1,000 years, continued, but they were now hollow performances, spectacles devoid of meaning. The great ceremony of the bull, once a profound and solemn renewal of the king's sacred oath, became mere political theater. The 10 kings would still hunt the bull in the sacred grove, but their minds were not on their divine father. They were on trade disputes, on military budgets, on the new palace a rival king was building. They would spill the bull's blood over the pillar of orichalcum, but the act was rote, a thing done because it had always been done. The blood was just blood now, a messy formality before the state banquet. The covenant was broken because they no longer believed in it. The magnificent temple, the spiritual heart of the empire, became its central bank. Its value was no longer measured in its sacredness, but in the literal tonnage of gold and silver stored in its vaults. The priests, once the wise counselors of kings and the keepers of the divine mysteries, transformed into wealthy administrators and shrewd asset managers. The high priest of Poseidon, a position once held by the most pious man in the kingdom, was now known more for his uncanny ability to predict fluctuations in the price of imported tin. Aspiring young acolytes found themselves studying less theology and more accounting, for they learned that while prayers for a bountiful harvest were good, prayers for a favorable return on the temple's offshore shipping investments were often answered far more quickly. A great empire that would rise in Italy many centuries later would have a name for the sacred principle the Atlanteans were now trampling. They called it the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. It was their belief that the welfare of the state rested upon a simple contract. The people perform the correct rituals with the correct piety, and in return, the gods grant the state prosperity, stability, and victory. To neglect the gods was to break the contract, inviting chaos and disaster. The Atlanteans, in their boundless hubris, were now tearing up this contract and tossing the pieces into the sea. They had come to believe that they had built their paradise themselves. They thought they no longer needed the favor of the gods, because their own power seemed so absolute. They even began to rewrite their own history. The beautiful, cherished story of the lonely sea god and the mortal maid Cleito was now dismissed in the royal courts as a quaint folk tale, a children's story. The new histories, commissioned by the arrogant kings and written by flattering scribes, downplayed the role of Poseidon. They emphasized instead the genius of the first mortal kings, the brilliance of the engineers who dug the canals, the courage of the generals who built the army. They were slowly and deliberately erasing the god from their own narrative, recasting themselves as self-made men. And perhaps the god noticed. The sea around the island, which had for so long been a gentle and predictable protector, grew more restless. Storms, once rare, now lashed the coast with greater frequency, their winds howling with what sounded almost like a mournful anger. Fishermen reported that the shoals were moving farther out to sea, the nets coming up emptier. Within the Silver Temple, the two sacred springs that Poseidon had created would sometimes run murky for a day, or the hot spring would run unnervingly cold. These were the first omens, the first stirrings of a forgotten power. But the Atlanteans, in their manic pursuit of wealth and glory, were too busy, too important to notice. A minor earthquake once rattled the city, causing a dozen of the king's newest, most self-aggrandizing statues to topple over. The official report from the royal geologist blamed routine tectonic settling. A lone elderly priest, however, was overheard muttering that it was probably just Poseidon clearing his throat, and that they should be far more worried about what happens when he actually has something to say. And the Pillar of Orichalcum, the very soul of their law, stood silent and ignored in the center of the temple. People would walk past it and admire it not as a living guide, but as a priceless artifact. They marveled at the antique script and the fiery sheen of the metal, but they no longer read the words. The sacred laws, do not take up arms against one another, come to each other's aid, rule with a common wisdom, had become a museum piece. When a nation forgets its gods, my lord, it is left with only its appetites. The Atlanteans had systematically hollowed out their own soul, leaving a terrible void where their faith used to be. And a void, by its very nature, demands to be filled. Theirs would be filled with a violent, insatiable lust for conquest. Sleep now, for soon you will hear the tramp of marching feet as the armies of Atlantis prepare to leave their paradise behind. An appetite for power, my lord, can never be satisfied. It can only be fed. The Atlanteans, having consumed their own virtue and hollowed out their own faith, now turned their hungry eyes to the world beyond their shores. Their vast wealth was no longer a source of contentment, but a tool. Their powerful military was no longer a shield, but a spear. The age of peaceful exploration was long dead. The age of brutal empire was dawning. Of course, they did not call it conquest. They called it enlightenment. They did not speak of subjugation, but of bringing order. In the grand councils of the 10 kings, they rationalized their aggression with the oldest and most treacherous lie in the long history of empire: that their own superiority gave them not just the right, but the sacred duty to rule over the lesser peoples of the world. They would bring Atlantean efficiency to the disorganized tribes of Europe. They would bring Atlantean culture to the dusty kingdoms of Africa. It was, they told their citizens, a benevolent crusade. The official slogan for the invasion, plastered on banners throughout the shining city, was bringing order through strength. A less popular but far more accurate version whispered in the dockside taverns was, "We want your stuff, and we're tired of asking nicely." And so the entire nation was reshaped for war. For centuries, the Atlantean military had been a well-trained but largely ceremonial force, a guarantee of their splendid isolation. Now it was reforged into a terrifying engine of destruction. The sunny gymnasiums, once centers for the celebration of the human form, became brutal military academies. The shipyards, which had once built elegant merchant vessels, now worked day and night, their slipways filled with the skeletons of new predatory warships called triremes. In this, Atlantis was becoming something grimly familiar to later historians, a state where the gears of the economy and the ambitions of the powerful become locked into a cycle of perpetual warfare. We of a later age would call it a military-industrial complex. The forges require ever more metal, so the mines must be deepened. The armies require ever more men, so the populace must be conscripted. The conquests bring in plunder and tribute, which funds the creation of even larger armies, which in turn require new conquests to sustain them. It is a serpent eating its own tail, and it drove Atlantis forward with a terrible, unstoppable momentum. The sheer scale of the force they assembled was enough to make the world tremble. Plato tells us the military was organized by the 10 kingdoms. Each of the 10 districts was required to provide its share of men and material. The numbers were staggering. The army was built around a core of 10,000 war chariots, each pulled by 2 magnificent horses. The navy consisted of 1,200 warships. The infantry numbered more than 500,000 men, their bronze shields polished to a mirror shine, and marching amongst them, their great forms clad in armor of bronze and orichalcum, were the war elephants, each one a living siege engine. The Department of War grew into a vast and bewildering bureaucracy. It took 100 scribes just to keep track of the chariot inventory, and a special commission was formed to debate the most strategically intimidating color to paint the war elephant's toenails. They eventually settled on crimson, a decision that took 6 months and generated a scroll of paperwork as tall as a man. Their target was nothing less than the known world. Their grand strategy, born of supreme arrogance, was to enslave the entire Mediterranean basin in a single, overwhelming rush. The Western Fleet would subdue the coasts of Africa, while the Eastern Fleet would crush the city-states of Greece and the Aegean. They would make the inner sea an Atlantean lake, and all the riches of the world would flow back to their glorious capital. On the day the great invasion fleet was set to depart, a lone elderly priest, one of the last who still remembered the old ways, stood on the cliffs overlooking the main harbor. He watched the 1,000-strong armada, the forests of masts, the sea teeming with soldiers, and he felt no pride. He felt only a profound and chilling sacrilege. His eyes drifted to the distant peak of the Silver Temple, and he remembered the words on the pillar within, "Do not take up arms against one another." He had always believed it meant the 10 kings should not fight each other, but now, in the twilight of his life, he feared it had a simpler, broader meaning. He looked out at the churning sea, at the unnaturally dark clouds gathering on the horizon, and he knew they were betraying the very God who had given them the waves to command. The crowds on the shore saw only glory. They cheered as the High King and his gilded chariot boarded the flagship. They roared as the trumpets sounded, and the 1,200 ships, in perfect formation, began to move down the Grand Canal toward the open sea. The sun glinted off 10,000 spear points and 1,000,000 polished shields. The greatest army the world had ever conceived set sail on a tide of absolute hubris. They went to conquer the world in the name of their own greatness, having utterly forgotten the God who gave them the sea as a gift. They believed themselves to be the storm. They could not imagine that they were sailing directly into the arms of a true and terrible storm that was waiting for them. Sleep now, my lord, if the tramp of those marching feet will let you, for the age of peace is definitively over. The clash of empires is at hand. Before the first spear was thrown, my lord, and before the first ship of that mighty armada had even reached the Pillars of Hercules, there was one last chance. One final, desperate opportunity for the kings of Atlantis to turn back from the abyss. The warning came not from a rival army or a stormy sea, but from a lone, quiet whisper from the heart of their own forsaken temple. Deep within the silver sanctuary of Poseidon, in a dark, steam-filled chamber near the sacred hot spring, there lived an oracle. She was an old woman, Theia by name, a distant descendant of one of the 10 original royal lines. In her, the divine blood had not been diluted by ambition, but distilled by piety into a single, fragile drop of clairvoyance. While the priests had become bankers and the kings had become warlords, she had remained a true servant of the god. To consult the oracle before a major undertaking was one of the oldest traditions of Atlantis. But to the new generation of kings, it was an embarrassing relic of a superstitious past. The High King Evenor II, a man who believed far more in logistical tables than in divine visions, saw it as a sign of weakness. He argued against it in his war council. But some of the lesser kings, men who still felt a flicker of fear for the old ways, insisted. And so, begrudgingly, the 10 kings agreed to perform the rite, treating it as one more administrative task to be checked off before the invasion could begin. In the world the Atlanteans were about to invade, this would have been no mere formality. For the Greeks of that age, consulting an oracle, most famously the Pythia who served the god Apollo at Delphi, was a momentous and terrifying step of statecraft. Great generals and powerful kings would make long, humbling pilgrimages to hear the god's will. The oracle's cryptic, riddling pronouncements were taken with the utmost seriousness, their meanings debated by scholars for weeks. To begin a war without the god's blessing was to invite certain and catastrophic doom. The 10 kings of Atlantis, however, arrived at the oracle's chamber seeing it as a tedious but necessary piece of public relations. They entered the small, dark room, their magnificent armor of polished bronze and orichalcum seeming loud and profane in the sacred quiet. The air was thick with the geothermal steam from the spring and the sharp, sweet scent of burning herbs. King Gadeirus of the southern province was mentally reviewing his timetables for the African campaign. King Asius of the eastern isles was still wondering if the new shade of crimson for the war elephants was perhaps a bit too gaudy. None of them were truly present. They were just waiting for the old woman to say her piece so they could get back to the important business of world domination. The old oracle, Theia, paid them no mind. She sat on a simple stone tripod over a fissure in the earth from which the hot vapors rose. She breathed them in, her frail body trembling as the spirit of the god began to stir within her. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and when she spoke, it was not with her own thin voice, but with a voice that was as deep and resonant as the sea in a cavern, a voice that made the very stones of the chamber vibrate. "You who were born of my waters," the voice boomed, "but have forgotten my name." The kings shifted uncomfortably. This was not the usual blessing for a bountiful harvest. "You build your pride on ships of wood and walls of metal," the voice continued, its tone a mixture of sorrow and rage. "But no wall can hold back the tide of my grief, and no ship can outrun the memory of your betrayal." A nervous murmur went through the kings. This was not going at all as planned. "Hear this, you sons of grasping men. The sea which was your cradle will become your grave. The island which I raised for love will be brought down by me for its arrogance. The name of Atlantis will be spoken only as a whisper, a ghost on the currents, a memory of a warning unheard." The voice ceased. The old woman slumped on her stool, seemingly drained of all life. The chamber was silent save for the hissing of the steam. The kings looked at one another, their faces a mixture of confusion and annoyance. The prophecy had been clear, direct, and utterly terrifying, and they refused completely to believe it. The High King, Evenor, was the first to break the silence. He strode forward, and placed a hand on the old oracle's shoulder in a gesture of condescending pity. "There, there, grandmother," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "A fine and very dramatic poem. You have a true gift for the theater. Now, if you will all excuse us, we have a world that needs conquering." He turned and strode from the chamber, the other 9 kings following in his wake, their nervous whispers quickly turning to dismissive laughter. They chuckled about the wild-eyed theatrics of the old priesthood. One of them remarked that they should really budget for a new, younger oracle for the next campaign, perhaps one with a more optimistic and pro-war outlook. The truth had been laid at their feet, a perfect, terrible jewel, and they had mistaken it for a common stone and kicked it aside into the darkness. The final warning had been given. The final chance for redemption had been scornfully refused. The great, grinding gears of fate, which their own arrogance had set in motion, now began to turn with an inexorable finality. Sleep now, my lord, for the war, with all its glories and all its horrors, begins on the morrow. The great fleet has sailed, my lord, an unstoppable tide of bronze and arrogance. Its goal is the subjugation of the known world. But as the deep shadow of its 1,000 ships begins to fall upon the sunny shores of the Mediterranean, one small city-state, nestled amongst rocky hills and olive groves, dares to stand in its way. Let us now leave the opulent corruption of Atlantis and travel to the dry, dusty plains of Attica to meet the people of ancient Athens. Now we must be clear. The Athens of this tale is not the sprawling marble city of the historian's record. This is not the Athens of Pericles and the Parthenon that Plato knew. This is its legendary ancestor, a prehistoric city from 9,000 years before, an Athens that existed in a purer, simpler, and more heroic age. It was a city of stone and virtue, not of gold and vice. Its people were hardy farmers, stoic soldiers, and fiercely argumentative philosophers. Its protector was not a forgotten sea god, but the clear-eyed goddess of wisdom herself, Athena. It is important to understand, my lord, that the philosopher Plato may have been crafting a deliberate contrast here. Just as he painted Atlantis as the ultimate cautionary tale, a mighty empire blessed with every gift, yet rotted from within by hubris, he painted this primeval Athens as its perfect opposite. This Athens was his vision of the ideal state, a society built not on immense wealth but on courage, reason, and moderation. He was staging a grand philosophical argument, played out with armies and heroes upon the vast stage of myth. The character of these ancient Athenians was the mirror image of all that the Atlanteans had become. Where the Atlanteans had grown soft with luxury, the Athenians practiced a stern and simple moderation, valuing honor far more than wealth. Where the Atlantean kings ruled through inherited power and selfish ambition, the leaders of Athens were chosen for their wisdom and their proven virtue. Where the Atlanteans had come to worship their own power, the Athenians held a deep and abiding piety for the gods of Olympus. They were a stubborn and difficult people, to be sure. The Athenians were known throughout the ancient world for 2 things: their unshakable courage in the face of tyranny, and their astonishing ability to argue for 3 hours about the single correct way to grill a fish. An invading general who was not immediately defeated by their disciplined spear wall was likely to be worn down to the point of surrender by having to listen to a lengthy public debate on the logistical disadvantages of his chosen marching formation. News of the invasion arrived on the hot summer winds, carried by terrified refugees from coastal towns that had been the first to fall. They brought tales that seemed like nightmares. A fleet so vast it choked the sea, soldiers whose armor shone with a strange fiery metal, and monstrous house-sized beasts that trampled men underfoot. Panic swept through the Greek city-states. One by one, the other nations of the mainland, paralyzed by fear, sent messengers of surrender to the Atlantean host. Soon, only Athens was left, alone, the last bastion of freedom in a world about to be enslaved. The leaders of the city gathered in their assembly on the rocky hill of the Acropolis. There was fear in the air, yes, but it was overshadowed by a cold, hard resolve. Here, there was no selfish bickering, no squabbling over who would get the most glory, as there was in the Atlantean war councils. The Athenian generals and statesmen spoke of duty, of honor, and of their sacred obligation to protect the liberty that their ancestors had won. They did not debate if they should fight. They debated only how they would win. The final vote to go to war was, by Athenian standards, shockingly quick. It passed with a 99% majority. The lone dissenting vote was cast by an elderly philosopher named Lycomedes, who argued that while the Atlanteans were indeed an existential threat, the motion to declare war was improperly worded in its third clause and really ought to be sent back to committee for revision. He was, of course, politely but firmly ignored. And so Athens stood as the last hope for the free world. A small citizen army, a few hundred ships, and the unwavering courage of its people were all that stood against the million-man professional war machine of the Atlantean Empire. It was a mismatch of comical proportions, a gnat defying a giant. But the Athenians did not see it that way. They were fighting for their homes, their children, and their gods. The Atlanteans were fighting for loot, and that, the Athenians believed, would make all the difference. The lines, my lord, were now drawn. On one side of the world, a mighty empire drowning in its own power, rotten to its core with pride. On the other, a small city, armed with little more than courage and a stubborn, unshakable belief in freedom. The unstoppable force was about to meet the immovable object. Sleep now, for when we next open our eyes, the world will tremble with the coming clash of bronze and orichalcum. The time for words, for prophecies, and for posturing is past, my lord. The armies are marshaled, the fleets have crossed the sea, and the dry, ancient land of Greece now holds its breath. Let us travel to the sun-baked plains of Attica, where the air smells of dust and wild thyme, and where the fate of the free world will be decided by the sharp and hungry edges of bronze and orichalcum. The Atlantean armada arrived on the coast like a plague of locusts, a fleet so vast it formed a new temporary coastline of its own. The 1,200 ships disgorged their cargo onto the beaches, a river of men, a flood of horses, and the thunderous tread of the great war elephants. Their advance inland was a study in arrogant power. The 10,000 chariots, their metal fittings gleaming, fanned out across the plains, their commanders utterly contemptuous of the primitive land they had come to conquer. Behind them marched the infantry, a seemingly endless column of soldiers drawn from every corner of the Atlantean Empire, their hearts filled with promises of plunder. They were an army that had never known defeat, and they could not conceive of it now. The Atlantean general, a royal cousin of the king named Danaus, was a master of logistics, but a complete novice in the art of humility. His pre-battle address to his commanders consisted mainly of complaining about the poor quality of the local Greek wine and assuring everyone they would be dining in the citadel of Athens within 3 days. It was not a particularly inspiring speech, even by the generally low standards of military oratory. He expected the Athenians to be so terrified by the sheer scale of his army that they would simply lay down their arms. But the Athenian general, a wise veteran named Acister, had no intention of fighting on the open plains, where the enemy's numbers and chariots would be decisive. He ceded the flatlands to the invaders, drawing his small, disciplined army back into the rocky, broken foothills that guarded the approaches to his city. He chose his ground with care: narrow passes, steep slopes, and uneven terrain where the might of the Atlantean chariot corps would be neutralized, and where their vast numbers would become a liability, a crowded, tangled mass. And here, my lord, we see the oldest and most epic story in the history of warfare played out upon the field. It is the eternal question: can a small force of superior training and unshakable motivation defeat a vast host of indifferent conscripts? The 30,000 disciplined Persian immortals asked this very question of 300 Spartan hoplites at the pass of Thermopylae. The French knights, in their thousands, asked it of a few hundred English longbowmen in the mud of Agincourt. Now the Atlanteans, with their million-man army, were asking it of the citizen soldiers of Athens, who were not fighting for a distant king's glory, but for their own children sleeping in their own homes just a few miles away. The first clash came as the sun reached its zenith. The Atlantean infantry, shouting their arrogance to the sky, surged forward into a valley chosen by Acister. They were a chaotic, glittering mob. The Athenians waited for them on the high ground, silent and still, locked together in their tight phalanx formation, a solid wall of bronze shields and iron will. The impact was like a wave breaking against a cliff. The roar of thousands of men, the splintering of spears, the horrifying, percussive crunch of metal on bone echoed through the hills. The Atlantean line, through sheer weight of numbers, began to push the Athenians back. Seeing this, General Deianeus unleashed his trump card. He signaled for the charge of the war elephants. The ground trembled as the monstrous beasts, clad in bronze armor and maddened by war horns, thundered towards the Athenian phalanx. The Athenian soldiers, who had heard tales of these creatures but never seen them, felt a primal wave of fear. But their discipline, drilled into them since boyhood, held firm. As the elephants crashed into their lines, the Athenians did not break. They parted their ranks at the last moment, creating channels through which the beasts could pass, while the soldiers in the rear ranks stabbed at their legs and flanks with their long spears. The elephants, wounded and terrified, panicked. They trumpeted in agony and ran amok, turning back into the Atlantean lines, trampling hundreds of their own soldiers in their blind flight. The battle devolved into a brutal, grinding stalemate. The Atlanteans would send forward wave after wave of fresh troops, but they could not break the Athenian line. The Athenians, fighting on their home soil, refused to yield a single inch of ground that was not paid for in blood. An Athenian hoplite was said to have been knocked unconscious by a flying stone early in the day. When he awoke hours later, the fighting was still raging in the exact same spot. He asked a bloodied comrade if they had advanced. The comrade, spitting dust, replied, "No, but we're still arguing the point." The sun finally set, my lord, on a landscape of unimaginable grief and exhaustion. The valley floor was a carpet of the fallen, the dust turned to red mud. The unstoppable army had been stopped. The small city had held. The Atlanteans, for the first time in their long and gilded history, had been met with a force their wealth could not intimidate, and their power could not simply crush. They had tasted true resistance, and they found its flavor to be unexpectedly bitter. Sleep now, for this terrible war has only just begun. A battle, my lord, is more than a simple contest of arms. It is a brutal contest of wills. The ferocious, unyielding resistance of the Athenians had bloodied the nose of the great Atlantean army. A swift and glorious conquest had devolved into a grinding, humiliating stalemate. So now we must ask, how does a man who has never known failure in his life react to its first, bitter taste? Let us leave the blood-soaked battlefield for a moment and enter the silken command pavilion of the High King of Atlantis, Evenor II. While the common soldiers of both armies licked their wounds and slept uneasily on the hard ground, King Evenor sat upon a gilded throne. His command post was not a Spartan tent of canvas and leather, but a sprawling pavilion of purple silk, its floors covered with priceless carpets. He dined not on hardtack and dried meat, but on roasted fowl and exotic fruits, served on golden plates and washed down with the finest imported wine. He was a king at war, but he had taken great pains to ensure the war did not inconvenience his comfort. This magnificent opulent bubble was the only world he knew, and it was a world where the word no was never spoken. His general Deianeus entered the tent, his orichalcum armor stained with the dust and grime of the real world outside. He bowed low and gave his report. He spoke of the shocking number of Atlantean casualties. He described the failure of the war elephants and the uselessness of the chariots in the broken terrain. He spoke with a grim admiration of the unbreakable discipline of the Athenian phalanx. His counsel was clear. The Athenians could not be broken by simple force. He advised a strategic withdrawal to the open plains, or a long, drawn-out siege to starve the city into submission. King Evenor listened, his handsome face twisting into a mask of disbelief, and then of pure, petulant rage. He did not hear a tactical assessment. He heard a personal insult. The idea that this small, grubby city of goat herders and philosophers was not collapsing in terror before his magnificent army was an affront to the natural order of the universe. He leapt to his feet, his eyes blazing. "Cowardice!" he bellowed, hurling his golden wine goblet against a tapestry. "You speak to me of strategy and patience when what I see is fear. Are you the commander of the world's greatest army, or a frightened schoolboy?" Historians of a later age would argue endlessly about what truly shapes the course of nations. Is it vast, impersonal forces, economics, climate, the slow, creeping decay of institutions? Or is it the will, the genius, or in this case, the monumental folly of a single powerful man? In this moment, in this silken tent, the Atlantean Empire became a testament to the latter. The fate of the world's greatest power was about to pivot on the fragile, wounded ego of one single angry king. Evenor stormed over to a magnificent carpet where a map of the world was woven, the island of Atlantis a swirl of gold thread at its center. "This," he snarled, gesturing at the tiny patch of thread representing Athens, "is not a strategic problem. It is an insect that must be crushed. It is an embarrassment that must be erased." Against the desperate advice of his general, and ignoring the worried glances of the other, lesser kings who attended him, Evenor dictated his orders for the coming day. There would be no clever maneuvers. There would be no siege. There would be a single, overwhelming, full frontal assault. He would commit all of his forces at once, every last chariot, every last infantryman, and his own elite royal guard. He would not outthink the Athenians. He would bury them under a mountain of flesh and steel. His plan was simple. We shall attack them from the front, with everything we have. One of the younger kings dared to ask, "And what if they hold again, my lord?" Evenor shot him a look of pure venom. "Then we shall attack them from the front a second time," he hissed, "but with more shouting." The strategic brilliance on display was, shall we say, underwhelming. The order was given. A decision that would seal the fate of 100,000 men was made not with a cool head, but with a hot and furious temper. The generals and the other kings, though many of them knew this was madness, were too cowed by the High King's fury to object further. The messengers were sent out. The Atlantean army began to prepare for a second day of battle, but this time the arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a grim sense of foreboding. The king's pride had just overruled all of their military sense. King Evenor was left alone in his pavilion. He poured himself another goblet of wine and stared down at his carpet, at the golden island, and the insignificant gray speck he was about to annihilate. He felt the familiar warm glow of his own certainty return. He was Evenor II, High King of Atlantis, descendant of the god Poseidon himself. The idea that he could fail was not just wrong, it was in his mind a logical impossibility. He had committed his entire army to a battle of pure, magnificent ego. He did not know, could not possibly comprehend, that he had just handed his enemy their one and only chance at victory. "Sleep now, my lord, for tomorrow pride itself goes to war, and the fall is always close behind." Pride, my lord, is a notoriously poor general. It is rash when it should be patient, and stubborn when it should be wise. King Evenor's arrogant order was given, and as the pale dawn broke over the hills of Attica, the dreadful sound of 100,000 angry men preparing for a final, brutal assault filled the air. Let us return to that desperate field of battle, to witness the terrible price of one man's wounded ego. The second day's attack was not a strategy. It was a tantrum, a wave of pure, overwhelming force, designed to pulverize the Athenians through sheer mass. At its head was the High King's own royal guard, 10,000 elite soldiers clad in gleaming armor of polished orichalcum, their long spears held in perfect formation. They were the best warriors in the world, and they had never been defeated. They marched forward in an unnerving, disciplined silence, a river of fiery metal flowing through the valley of death. Behind them, the rest of the vast Atlantean army surged, a chaotic and roaring tide of men. Their fear from the previous day burned away by the king's furious exhortations. The Athenians were waiting. They had spent the night not sleeping, but reinforcing their lines with walls of stone and sharpened stakes, and tending to their thousands of wounded. They were outnumbered, exhausted and bleeding, but their resolve had hardened into something cold, sharp, and unbreakable. They watched the glittering host advance, and as the Atlanteans broke into a charge, the Athenians did not shout a battle cry. They simply braced their shields, lowered their spears, and held. The impact was the sound of a world breaking. The Atlantean royal guard, with their superior armor and relentless discipline, slammed into the Athenian phalanx. This time the line bent, it groaned, and for one terrible, heart-stopping moment it broke. A company of orichalcum-clad warriors punched through the center of the Athenian line. The invaders roared in triumph. Victory was in their grasp. But the Athenian general, Acastor, had anticipated this. He had held back one final desperate reserve, 500 of his oldest and most experienced veterans. As the Atlantean elites poured through the gap, Acastor led the charge himself, a gray-haired whirlwind of bronze and fury. They slammed into the flank of the Atlantean breakthrough, not to defeat them, but simply to hold them, to buy a few precious moments. This was the high watermark of the invasion, the single moment upon which the fate of the world turned. Seeing their general and their elders fighting with such suicidal courage, the rest of the Athenian line found a new strength. With a great unified cry, they pushed back, closing the gap, surrounding and trapping the Atlantean royal guard. The best soldiers in the world, caught between the hammer of the reserve and the anvil of the main line, were systematically, tragically cut down. When the rest of the Atlantean army saw the impossible, their invincible royal guard being annihilated, a wave of collective shock and terror washed over them. The discipline they had vanished. The battle rage evaporated, replaced by a primal need to survive. The line wavered, it buckled, and then all at once it shattered. The retreat became a mad, chaotic stampede. In the rout, General Dioneus was nearly trampled by his own men. He was saved only when a quick-thinking aide screamed, "Make way! The general has urgent business back at the ships. He forgot his favorite ceremonial helmet." It was not the most heroic moment in the long annals of the Atlantean military. The sun began to set on a field of profound and echoing silence. The Athenians had won. The invasion was broken. But as Acastor looked out upon the thousands of his own fallen citizens, he felt no joy. A Greek king, many centuries after this mythical war, would give his name to this exact feeling. King Pyrrhus of Epirus, after defeating the Romans but losing the flower of his army, looked upon the battlefield and said, "Another such victory, and we are undone." This, my lord, was the fate of Athens. They had saved the world, but they had all but destroyed themselves in the process. There were no victory cheers in their camp that night, only the quiet grief of the survivors. Back on the beaches, the shattered remnants of the Atlantean army stumbled back to their ships. King Evenor sat motionless in his pavilion, staring at his trampled, wine-stained carpet, his mind utterly unable to process the reality of his defeat. An aide gently tried to inform him that the war was lost. The king simply pointed a trembling finger at the map and whispered, "That's not supposed to be there." His grasp of both geography and reality had completely deserted him. The surviving kings, their arrogance replaced with cold fury and fear, gave the order to embark. The great invasion was over. The war was finished. The invaders were repelled. But there were no victory parades, my lord, only the exhausted silence of the victors and the profound humiliation of the defeated. Athens had won the battle, but the entire world felt as if it had lost the war, left fractured and weak. And back on the island of Atlantis, the shamed and broken kings sailed for home, their hearts filled with a black and bitter rage, a rage that would soon be eclipsed by a far greater and more final terror. Sleep now, for the judgment of the gods is coming. The affairs of mortals, my lord, however grand and tragic they may seem to us, are but a brief and noisy play performed on a vast cosmic stage. And all the while, an eternal audience watches from the heavens. The great war between Athens and Atlantis was now over. The broken armies sailed for home, and in their most holy habitation, which sits at the very center of the world, that divine audience convened to deliver its final terrible review. This is the moment, my lord, where the ancient manuscript of the philosopher Cleito tantalizingly breaks off. He tells us that Zeus, the god of gods, who rules all things according to law, saw that the once honorable race of Atlanteans was now in a truly woeful state. Wishing to inflict a punishment upon them, that they might be chastened and learn from their fall, he gathered all the other gods together, and when they were assembled, he began to speak, and there, The story ends. The ink stops. The rest is silence, but we, in the quiet of the night, can surely imagine what was said. Let us picture the scene. The great gods of Olympus, gathered in a hall of cloud and light. There is Hera, the stern queen, and Apollo of the silver bow, his face uncharacteristically grim. There is Artemis the huntress, and Athena, the protector of Athens, her eyes filled with a weary pride for her victorious city. Ares, the god of war, is present, looking thoroughly disappointed that the Atlanteans, for all their bluster, had proven to be such incompetent conquerors. And amongst them, silent and cloaked in shadow, is the mighty Poseidon, his face a mask of ancient, inconsolable grief. And presiding over them all is Zeus, king of the gods and men. From his throne, he can see all things. He sees not just the battles and the politics, but the state of every mortal soul. He has watched the slow, cancerous rot of pride consume the hearts of the Atlanteans. He has seen them forget their sacred oaths, mock their divine heritage, and wage a war of pure, unrighteous greed. Such meetings of the gods are a cornerstone of all great myths. In the epic poems of Troy, the Olympians gathered just like this to argue and decide the fates of Achilles and Hector below. These divine councils serve to remind us of the true scale of things. They show us that the struggles that feel so total and all-consuming to mortals are, from a divine perspective, matters of cosmic law and universal balance. The Atlanteans believed they were the masters of their own destiny. They were about to learn that they were merely characters in a much older and grander story. The voice of Zeus filled the hall, not with a roar of anger, but with the low, heavy rumble of an approaching storm. He laid out the case against the children of Poseidon. They were a race, he said, who had been given every possible gift. They were born of divine blood, into a paradise of unimaginable bounty. They were given wisdom, strength, and beauty, and they had squandered it all. They had taken their blessings and forged them into weapons of arrogance. They had taken the sacred laws of their father and used them as a doormat upon which to wipe their muddy, grasping feet. They had, in their hubris, attempted to enslave the world. Ares, the god of war, cleared his throat, perhaps to argue that any nation willing to start such a large and impressive war couldn't be all bad. But a single, sharp glance from Zeus, a glance that promised 1,000 years of being used as target practice for thunderbolts, made Ares decide to take a sudden and profound interest in the intricate cloud patterns on the Olympian floor. The true tragedy in the room was Poseidon. He did not speak. He could not. This was his family being condemned, the distant descendants of his beloved mortal Cleito. He had watched them for millennia, had seen their virtue fade and their pride metastasize. He had sent them omens. He had whispered warnings on the wind and in the tides. He had tried to turn them back, but they had grown deaf to his voice. He knew the judgment was just, and so he said nothing. His sorrowful silence was his consent. They have become a sickness in the world, Zeus concluded, a beautiful vessel that is filled with poison, and the sickness must be cleansed. The vessel must be broken, lest its poison infect all of humanity for all time to come. Hera, Zeus's wife, nodded in stern and unwavering approval. She had, if we are being honest, never been a great fan of Poseidon's various mortal affairs, and saw the entire Atlantean civilization as the rather loud and gaudy result of one of them. She had been waiting 9,000 years for this moment, and her expression was one of profound divine satisfaction. The sentence was pronounced. It would not be a war. It would not be a plague. The punishment would fit the crime with a terrible and poetic justice. Their empire was born from the sea, a gift of Poseidon's power. It would be taken back by the sea, a demonstration of that same power. In a single, dreadful day and night, Zeus decreed, the island of Atlantis would be erased from the face of the world, its memory to serve as an eternal warning against the sins of pride and greed. The gods of Olympus assented. The judgment was passed. The divine council dispersed in silence. Down below, on the dark and mortal sea, the last broken ships of the Atlantean fleet finally saw the familiar fiery glow of their brass wall on the horizon. They were coming home, seeking solace and refuge in their perfect, unconquerable city. They did not know that they were sailing toward a tomb. Sleep now, my lord, for the very earth is about to begin to tremble. The judgment of the gods had been passed in the silent, eternal halls of heaven. And now, my lord, the executioner begins its slow, inexorable walk to the gallows. Let us return to the island of Atlantis, where the broken and defeated fleet has just limped home, bringing with them the strange and bitter taste of their first great failure. They came seeking the comfort of their perfect city, but their home was no longer a place of peace. There were no victory parades for the returning army. There were no cheering crowds. As the surviving ships sailed down the Grand Canal, they were met with a stunned, bewildered silence. The news of their humiliating defeat at the hands of the Athenians had already swept through the city, and the people could not comprehend it. Shame hung over the capital like a thick and suffocating fog. The kings, especially the High King Evenor, locked themselves away in their palaces, unable to face the accusing eyes of their subjects. The entire island was caught in a state of sullen, wounded pride. And then, the earth itself offered a distraction. It began as something barely perceptible, a faint, low-frequency hum that seemed to come not through the ears, but up through the soles of the feet, a vibration in the very bones. A servant, pouring wine for the brooding king, saw the dark liquid in the golden goblet tremble, forming a pattern of tiny, concentric rings. In the silver temple, a priceless vase from a forgotten age rattled on its pedestal for a moment, then tipped and shattered on the marble floor. Most people felt nothing at all. The few who did dismissed it. Their island was volcanic, born of ancient fire. The ground had always been restless. Their buildings, monuments to their own engineering genius, were designed to withstand far worse. Geologists of a far later age would have a name for what the island was experiencing. They would call it a seismic swarm. It is a phenomenon often registered in the days and hours before a catastrophic volcanic eruption or a great tectonic event. Hundreds of tiny, deep earthquakes begin to shudder through the bedrock, a sign of immense and growing pressure in the world below. It is the earth groaning in its sleep, stirring from a long slumber, just before it awakens into a nightmare. But the Atlanteans had no geologists. They had only their peerless arrogance, which assured them that the very ground they walked upon would not dare to betray them. As the hours passed, the tremors grew more frequent, more insistent. It was no longer a single fleeting shudder, but a constant, unnerving vibration, like being on the deck of a great ship with a straining engine. The animals were the first to understand the truth. The magnificent horses in the hippodromes became frantic, kicking at their stalls, their eyes wide with a terror their masters could not comprehend. The elephants in the royal pens began to sway and trumpet, a low, mournful sound of deep and abiding distress. In the royal palace, King Evenor convened a council to address what his advisors were calling the persistent vibrational anomaly. After 3 hours of pompous debate, during which they blamed everything from the tides to the recent war, they concluded it was most likely a resonance issue with the city's extensive subterranean plumbing. A royal decree was issued ordering the city's chief plumber to find whatever pipe was loose and tighten it. It remains perhaps the most tragically understated diagnosis of a world-ending cataclysm in all of human history. King Evenor, stewing in the acid of his humiliation, saw the shaking of the island as yet another personal insult. He was furious at the earth itself for daring to add this annoyance to his already considerable misery. He commanded the priests, the ones he had ignored for so long, to make a sacrifice to Poseidon, the forgotten earth-shaker. He did it not from a place of renewed piety, but with the irritated impatience of a man paying a troublesome landlord to fix a leaky roof. The priests, their own hearts heavy with a nameless dread, performed the ritual. But their hands trembled so much they could barely hold the sacred knife. The smoke from the sacrificial fire did not rise to the heavens. It clung to the ground like a greasy, foul-smelling shroud. The high priest, a man whose spine was made of jelly, looked at these terrible omens, then at his king's furious face, and announced with a forced and quavering cheerfulness, "The gods are pleased, my lord." They signal that a great and powerful change is coming, a time of renewal. He was, in a way, technically correct. As twilight began to bleed across the sky, the character of the tremors changed again. The gentle, vibrating hum deepened into a guttural roar that seemed to emanate from the planet's very core. The whole city was now in motion, a constant, sickening sway. The concentric rings of water in the canals, with no wind to stir them, were agitated with strange, pulsing ripples. Finally, the people of Atlantis stopped their work. They came out into the streets and looked at each other, their confident smiles replaced by masks of confusion and the first cold stirrings of fear. The island was groaning in its sleep. The deep stone bones of their perfect world were in agony. For centuries, the Atlanteans had used Poseidon's ancient title, the Earth Shaker, as a boast, a proud reminder of their divine heritage. They had forgotten that it was not just a title. It was a description of a terrifying power and a promise of what was to come. Sleep now, my lord, if the trembling of the world will let you, for the long, dark night has just begun. The night was a long torment of shaking earth and creeping fear, my lord. Sleep was impossible. The people of Atlantis, huddled in their magnificent but trembling homes, waited desperately for the dawn, for the familiar comfort of the sun. But the sun, on this day of divine judgment, would offer no comfort at all. It rose, but it was not the familiar brilliant orb they knew. It was a sickly, swollen thing, the color of a festering wound, and it seemed to struggle to climb into the sky. It gave off no warmth, only a dim, reddish and apocalyptic light. A strange, high-altitude haze, a brownish veil, had covered the heavens, and the sun's rays struggled to pierce it. As the morning wore on, the light did not grow stronger, it grew weaker. The source of the haze became clear. From the crater of the great central mountain, the one from which they mined their fiery orichalcum, a column of black smoke was now rising, not in a violent plume, but in a thick, steady, inexorable pillar that reached to the very edge of the sky. By what should have been noon, the battle between light and shadow was over. The pillar of smoke and ash fanned out into a vast, dark ceiling, a funeral shroud that draped itself over the entire island. Slowly, unnervingly, the sickly red twilight faded to a bruised purple, then to a deep, profound black. Midday in a tropical paradise became as dark as a moonless night in a subterranean cave. In the ages before science, my lord, there was no celestial event more terrifying than the unexpected death of the sun. An eclipse was never a simple alignment of heavenly bodies. It was a cosmic omen of the highest order. It was a sign of divine rage, a harbinger of the death of kings, the fall of nations, the end of the world itself. At the sight of the vanishing sun, entire armies would throw down their weapons and flee. Civilizations would fall to their knees in terror, believing the gods had finally withdrawn their favor from the world. The Atlanteans were now living through the ultimate eclipse, one not caused by the moon, but by the deliberate hand of a god, a darkness sent specifically for them and from which the sun would not return. A sudden and unnatural cold descended upon the island, chilling the bones of a people used to perpetual warmth. A profound and terrible silence fell. The birds, confused and terrified, ceased their songs. The insects went quiet. The only sound left in the world was the constant, deep, guttural roar that came from the tortured earth beneath their feet. The air itself grew thick and heavy, and it carried a new and frightening smell, the sharp metallic tang of sulfur, the breath of the volcano. In his palace, King Evenor, now half mad with fear and rage, commanded that every torch, lamp, and brazier in the city be lit. His servants scrambled to obey, and for a time, the capital city of Poseidonis glowed with 1,000,000 tiny, desperate flickering flames against the absolute darkness. It did little to dispel the gloom, of course, but it did create a truly spectacular fire hazard, adding one more acute worry to an already quite stressful day. The perfect order of their city finally broke. Panic, that most human of emotions, took hold. People began to run through the darkened streets, their faces lit by the ghastly dancing light of torches. Some sought shelter in their homes, others ran for the temples. The canals, agitated by the unceasing tremors, began to slosh violently, spilling over their stone banks and sending muddy water flooding into the lower avenues. The priests and kings, their authority now a meaningless joke, gathered in the great silver temple. They lit huge bonfires on the altar, the flames casting monstrous, leaping shadows across the golden statues and the ivory ceiling. They performed frantic, clumsy sacrifices, their hands slick with sweat and blood, screaming the name of Poseidon, the god they had ignored for generations, into the suffocating darkness. But their prayers were no longer prayers. They were just the terrified noises of trapped animals. The high priest, who had so confidently predicted a time of renewal, was now huddled in a corner, frantically trying to find a theological loophole in the prophecy. Perhaps, he was heard muttering to a terrified acolyte, the oracle meant a spiritual darkness, a metaphor for our coming period of moral reflection. Yes, that must be it. The acolyte, however, was unconvinced, pointing out that metaphors rarely smell so strongly of brimstone. And then something new began to fall from the black sky. Not rain. It was a fine, soft gray powder, a gentle, persistent, and unending shower of ash. It silently coated every surface, the brass walls, the silver temple, the panicked faces of the people, in a uniform layer of gray dust. It got in their eyes, their mouths, their lungs. It was the substance of the mountain itself, pulverized and cast out, a premature burial for the entire island. The sun was dead. The sky was falling. The very air they breathed was turning to dust. The Atlanteans, who had so recently believed themselves to be the brightest and most glorious light in the world, were now trapped in a cold, choking, and absolute darkness of the god's own making. Their final, terrible omen had been delivered. There would be no more warnings after this. Sleep now, my lord, and gather what strength you can, for the final dreadful night is coming. The final terrible night has come, my lord. The omens have been given, the darkness has fallen, and the earth has groaned its last agonized warning. There is nothing left now but the carrying out of the sentence itself. So let us be still, and let us watch in the awful silence of this final hour, as a god takes back his broken creation. The end did not come with a whisper. It came with a roar. The constant, deep-throated rumbling from the heart of the world, which had become the only sound in the dark and shaking city, suddenly ceased. For one long, terrifying second, there was absolute silence and absolute stillness. And then, with a violence that is beyond all mortal comprehension, the main earthquake struck. It was not a shaking. It was a liquid convulsion of the very fabric of reality. The solid ground, the bedrock of their civilization, began to move in great, sickening, oceanic waves. The laws of nature were being unwritten. In the city, the magnificent bridges, engineered to withstand the weight of armies, arched their backs like dying beasts, their stones cracking and exploding outwards before they plunged into the churning canals below. The beautiful tricolored buildings that lined the avenues rippled as if they were made of cloth, their walls dissolving into clouds of multicolored dust. The great glittering walls of brass and tin, which had defined their world, buckled and split apart, torn asunder as the concentric rings of land they stood upon began to collapse into one another. Scientists of a future age, those who study the violent anatomy of our world, would have a name for what was happening. It is called a caldera collapse. When the vast, molten heart of a supervolcano empties itself in a final, furious eruption of ash and gas, it leaves a hollow, unsupported void deep within the earth. The land above, its foundations now gone, can then fall catastrophically into this empty chamber. An entire island, in a matter of mere hours, can simply fold into itself. It is not a sinking, it is a swallowing. On the central Acropolis, the silver temple of Poseidon, the last and greatest monument to their lost glory, held out the longest. As the city around it was being erased, it stood defiant in the darkness, a single point of terrible, tragic beauty. But then, with a sound like the tearing of the sky, its vast ivory ceiling shattered, raining down upon the golden statues like splinters of bone. The silver walls, a moment ago so proud, folded inwards with a soft, metallic sigh, and the colossal golden statue of Poseidon, the very god who was the author of this destruction, tilted slowly forward and sank into the fracturing earth, its serene, divine face the last thing to vanish into the abyss. The Pillar of Orichalcum, its sacred ignored laws now meaningless, was the final thing to go. It snapped in two with a sharp crack that was heard even over the roar of the world's end, and was gone. In his crumbling palace, the High King Evanor was said to have stood on his balcony, screaming curses not at the gods he had denied, but at his long-dead architects for failing to engineer a city that could withstand the end of the world. It seems that even in the face of total shrieking oblivion, his pride could still find someone else to blame. As the island collapsed inward, the ocean, which had been held at bay by divine will for 10,000 years, was finally released from its bonds. From all sides at once, the sea rose up, a great wall of black water, a tsunami born not of a distant earthquake, but of the island's own death throes, rushed inwards. It poured over the ruined remnants of the outer walls, its immense weight and power scouring the land clean. It filled the collapsing rings of the canals, extinguishing the million fires of the dying city with a vast, final, vaporous hiss. The noise was absolute, the grinding roar of a collapsing continent, the thunder of a vengeful ocean, the shriek of a civilization being erased from existence. And then, as the last, highest peak of the central mountain slid beneath the churning, boiling waves, there was a profound and unearthly silence. The silence of a thing that is utterly and completely finished. And so it came to pass, my lord, exactly as the old story tells it. In a single day and one terrible night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis, with all its works, all its people, and all its pride, disappeared into the depths of the sea. When the sun rose the next morning, it rose on a clear and empty sky. It shone down upon a calm and placid ocean. But where a mighty island continent had once stood, there was now nothing. Only the gentle blue-green swell of the endless water. A few splinters of wood, a scrap of a deep blue sail, a single floating red blossom from a forgotten royal garden. These were the only signs that the greatest empire in the history of the world had ever existed at all. The judgment was complete. The sickness was cleansed. The sea was peaceful once more, holding its terrible new secret in its deep, dark, and silent heart. The world was quieter now. It was lighter. But the memory of what was lost would haunt the dreams of humanity for all the ages to come. Sleep now, my lord. Sleep in the deep and final silence that follows the greatest of all storms. The world was wiped clean. The great island was gone, its very name known only to the silent, restless sea. And so, my lord, you must be asking a simple question. If all was lost, if every soul was consumed and every stone was swallowed, then how do we sit here on this quiet night speaking its name? How did a story survive the death of the very world that had birthed it? The tale survived, like a single seed from a burned forest, because of two things: the meticulous record-keeping of the Egyptians and the insatiable curiosity of a traveling Greek. Remember that the Atlantean war of aggression was not only against Athens, it was against the whole Mediterranean. The ancient kingdom of Egypt, with its long memory and its cities of stone, had also been threatened. And so, when the world was saved by the courage of the primeval Athenians, the Egyptian priests, who were the great librarians of antiquity, recorded the event. They inscribed upon their temple pillars, in their sacred hieroglyphs, the story of the mighty power from the Atlantic and of the small, virtuous city that had miraculously repelled it. And then, they recorded the final, terrible act of the gods, when the offending island was wiped from the map. And there the story lay, carved in stone for 9,000 years. Then, around the year 600 before the age of common men, a great Athenian statesman, a lawmaker and a poet named Solon, traveled to Egypt. He was a man hungry for knowledge, and he sought out the wisdom of their most ancient priests in the city of Sais. A wizened old priest, his face a mask of wrinkles, welcomed him. He listened patiently as Solon proudly recounted the great myths of Greece. When Solon had finished, the priest smiled a slow, weary smile. "O Solon, Solon," he said gently, "you Greeks are all children. You have no history that is truly old." He explained that floods and fires had repeatedly wiped out Greek learning, but that Egypt, eternal Egypt, remembered everything. And to prove it, he told Solon a story from his people's oldest records, a story of a war, 9,000 years past, that the Greeks themselves had completely forgotten. He told him of the great island of Atlantis, of its power and its arrogance, and he told him of the incredible heroism of Solon's own ancestors, the prehistoric Athenians who had stood alone and saved the world. Solon, we are told, was utterly astonished, and he diligently wrote down all that the priest told him, intending to make it the subject of a great epic poem. And here, my lord, is where the scholars of our age draw their intellectual knives and begin to argue. Did this conversation truly happen? Did the celebrated Solon really learn this tale in an Egyptian temple? Or was this the philosopher Plato's greatest and most clever invention? A fabricated ancient source, a perfect backstory, designed to give his philosophical tale of a fallen paradise the unshakable authority of sacred, forgotten history. We shall never know for certain. Solon, being a busy politician, never did get around to writing his epic poem. He likely got bogged down in some legislative committee meeting about Athenian tax reform. Even the greatest stories in the world can be defeated by bureaucracy. But he did not let the story die. He told it to his dear friend and relative, a man named Dropides. Dropides, in turn, told it to his son, who was named Critias. And this elder Critias, when he was a very old man of 90, told the story to his favorite grandson, a 10-year-old boy, who was also, confusingly, named Critias. Let us picture that scene. A cold night in Athens. A small boy sitting at the feet of his ancient grandfather by a crackling fire. The old man, his memory sparked by a song, begins to tell a story he has not thought of in decades. A true story, he insists, about a world that is no more. And he tells the boy everything. Of the city of concentric circles, of the fiery metal orichalcum, of the war elephants and the great battles, and of the final terrible night when the entire island sank beneath the waves. The young Critias was, not surprisingly, captivated. A tale of magic, war, and a whole continent sinking is significantly more interesting than the usual stories old men tell their grandsons, which mostly involve complaining about the price of olives and the general lack of respect in the younger generation. Many decades passed. This younger Critias was now an old man himself, a nobleman of Athens, and a cousin and friend to the greatest philosopher of the age, Plato. One evening, Plato and his circle were discussing the nature of the perfect society. Critias, listening, suddenly declared that he knew a story that was not a myth, but a true account of history, that was the perfect illustration of their debate, and he began to tell the tale his grandfather had told him all those years ago by the fire. Plato listened, and in the story of the virtuous ideal Athens and the corrupt fallen Atlantis, he recognized the most powerful cautionary tale ever conceived. He saw in it the grand themes of order and chaos, of virtue and hubris, of divine fate and human folly, and he took the whispered tale, this fragile chain of voices stretching across 90 centuries of silence, and he set it down for all time, preserving it forever in two of his famous dialogues, the Timaeus and the unfinished story that bears his cousin's name, the Critias. And so the whisper survived. From Egyptian stone to an old priest's tongue to a statesman's notes, through a family's cherished memory, from a grandfather to a wide-eyed child. The island was gone. The kings were dust. The gold was lost forever in the abyss. But the story, my lord, the story endured. Sleep now, for our own tale is almost at an end, but the ghost of Atlantis is only just beginning its long and restless journey through the mind of man. And so we come to the final night of our long tale, my lord. The story is told. The great city is lost. Its people are silenced, and the fragile whisper of its existence is now safe in the ink of a philosopher's scroll. But a story of such power, once it is told, does not simply end. It escapes. It breaks free from the page and takes on a strange and restless life of its own. Let us now, in this last hour before the dawn, look upon the long and curious afterlife of the drowned island of Atlantis. For many centuries after Plato first wrote it down, the story was treated as just that, a story. A brilliant philosophical fable, a cautionary tale, an allegory about the eternal struggle between order and hubris. Scholars debated its meaning, not its location. They searched for Atlantis not on maps, but in the pages of political theory. The idea of looking for a real physical place would have seemed to them as foolish as excavating the earth to find the literal gates of Hades. But then, the world changed. The great age of discovery dawned. Brave and reckless men in wooden ships sailed past the Pillars of Hercules, the edge of the old world, and did not fall off. Instead, they found two vast new continents teeming with strange civilizations. And suddenly, Plato's words began to sound less like a fable and more like a geography lesson. Had he not spoken of a great power in the Atlantic? Had he not described a continent? The search for the physical Atlantis began. Explorers and scholars, their imaginations ignited, began to see the ghost of the lost island everywhere. They looked for it in the Americas, in the Canary Islands, in the frozen plains of Scandinavia, and on the misty shores of Ireland. Every ancient ruin, every strange underwater rock formation, every confusing old map was offered up as tantalizing proof. The true high priest of this new religion of Atlantis was a curious and excitable American politician of the 19th century named Ignatius Donnelly. In 1882, he published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. It was a work of what modern scholars would gently call enthusiastic and creative speculation. Donnelly took Plato's story and supercharged it with romantic energy. He argued that Atlantis was not just a real place, but that it had been the mother civilization of the entire world. The source of the Egyptian pyramids, the Mayan temples, the art of metallurgy, the alphabet, and everything in between. He transformed Plato's stern moral warning into a beautiful tragic story of a lost golden age. His book was a global sensation, and for the next century, it seemed you couldn't find a strangely shaped rock anywhere on Earth without an amateur archaeologist declaring it to be a remnant of Atlantean masonry. Geologists would patiently explain that it was just a basalt formation, but the true believers would simply nod knowingly and whisper, "Yes, just what a surviving Atlantean would want you to think." And so the legacy split in two. For the historians and the philosophers, Atlantis remains Plato's perfect cautionary tale. But for the rest of the world, for the dreamers, the poets, the mystics, and the storytellers, it has become something more. It is the ultimate legend of the lost paradise. It is our shorthand for any great civilization that has vanished, any golden age that has been brought low. It is a ghost that haunts not only our maps, but our collective imagination. For in the end, my lord, what is the true legacy of this story? It is not the endless, fruitless search for sunken columns in the depths of the ocean. The true legacy is the warning, a warning that we have been given for more than 2,000 years, and which we seem to be stubbornly determined to ignore. Humanity has been told this perfect cautionary tale about what happens when a civilization becomes too wealthy, too powerful, and too arrogant for its own good. And for 2,000 years we have listened intently, nodded thoughtfully, praised the story's literary merit, and then gone right on being arrogant, greedy, and far too powerful for our own good. We are, it seems, very slow learners. Perhaps the search for a physical Atlantis has always missed the point. Perhaps the island is not a place you can find on a map. The true lost continent is a map of the human soul. It is a place of divine potential, capable of building a perfect paradise. But it is also a place with a fatal geological flaw in its very foundation, a fault line of pride, of greed, and of ambition that is always trembling, always threatening to bring the whole magnificent structure crashing down. The ghost that haunts our maps, my lord, is our own. And that is the entire history of the lost island of Atlantis. A story born of a god's lonely love, a city built to geometric perfection, a people blessed with every gift, a paradise lost not to an enemy, but to the flaws within themselves. It is a warning, a mystery, and a dream. The tale is finished. May it bring you peace and perhaps a little wisdom. Sleep well, my lord, sleep well.